Hey guys, welcome to this session by K21academy. In this session, we will be learning about Microsoft Azure comprehensively. Now let us take a quick glance at the agenda. Firstly, we will begin with cloud computing overview and then we will try to understand the difference between scalability and elasticity. Post that, we will try to understand about the process bring your own license. And then we will try to understand about cloud service models, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. Post that, we will try to understand the cloud deployment models, public cloud, private cloud, and hybrid cloud. And then we will try to understand about Azure account, subscriptions, and billing. Post that, we will try to understand the compute services like virtual machine, app service, functions, logic apps, container, and Kubernetes. And then we will try to understand the network services like virtual net, subnet, VPN gateway, ExpressRoute, network security groups, and Bastion host. Post that, we will try to understand more about storage services like storage account, blob, file, disk, and queue. And then we will learn about data box and import or export. And then you will be learning about database services in Azure like Azure SQL, Cosmos DB, Synaps DB, Azure Data Factory, and Azure Data Lake Storage. Post that, we will try to understand more about data protection like virtual machine backups and Azure site recovery. Post that, we will try to understand about monitoring services like monitor, alerts, and log analytics. And then we will try to understand about virtual machine migration service like VMware and Hyper-V. Post that, we will try to understand about data transfer service. We are also going to cover about Azure DevOps, where you will be learning about Azure boards, repositories, pipelines, test plans, and Azure artifacts. And then you will learn about artificial intelligence and machine learning on Azure for data scientists. Post that, you will learn about global infrastructure like region, paired region, availability zone, update, and fault domain. Post that, you will learn about resource, Azure Resource Manager, resource and management group. And then we will be looking at management tools like Azure Portal, Cloud Shell, Command Line Interface, PowerShell, and Azure Resource Manager templates. And finally, at the end, we will see how to create an Azure Cloud account. We have taken a clip from one of our certification training program on Microsoft Azure Solutions Architect. And in this clip, our expert will be talking about Microsoft Azure comprehensively.
Hey there, this is Atul from team K21 Academy. We are going to look at cloud overview. So what is the cloud computing? As per the definition, cloud computing is the delivery of your computing services like your servers, which consist of memory and CPU, then different type of storage, which could be a block storage, object storage, file storage, your databases, and different type of data, which is like unstructured data, structured data, semi-structured data, like SQL or NoSQL we say, networking, which includes your virtual networks, subnets, connectivity with on-premise, and so on, including tools and softwares over the internet. Now, the cloud computing has a specific properties, which I'll explain that in a minute, but cloud computing enables companies to consume a compute resource, which is your memory and CPU and associated services like storage, including applications and databases similar to what you consume these days, like your water or electricity, which means you only pay for what you use. And if you need more, you can ask for more. If you don't use more, you don't pay for more. So you are using these services these days like as you use for water or electricity, rather than having to build your own, maintain and manage your infrastructure. Now there are certain characteristics are available, consist of, which I'll cover in a second, but this is where you have like your servers and underlying infrastructure on which you're running your applications as well as databases, and you can access it anywhere from the internet as long as you have the network connectivity or associated connectivity. Now, cloud computing has some specific characteristics, like first one is on-demand self-service. So there's no human intervention needed in order to get resources. Now you and I can go and create resources. Later in this module, we are going to create an account on a respective cloud, and then we will be able to create an access, or we will be able to create these resources without any intervention. Then it has a broad network access, meaning it can be accessed from anywhere. And at the same time, you can also control and say who can access your servers from where. You can even put network boundaries around that. It's a resource pooling, meaning your resources provide shared resource access to customers. Now, including the security. So, which means I can't see your data, you can't see my data. So, there is a logical segregation of the data. And these are done at different levels, depending on if you're talking about virtual or compute. It's like segregated at a virtual machine level. If it's a network is all segregated and so on. Then it's rapid elasticity, which means you can scale up, you can increase the demand as you need it and maybe bring it back if you don't need it or return back those resources to the cloud vendor. For example, if you might have seen for retail industry, they need during the sale period, they might need a lot more servers so that they can cater a lot more traffic to their website. And as the sale period is over, you might need less resources. You can scale up and scale down that elasticity. And then it's measured service, which means you only pay what you use. So if I'm using more, I pay more. If I don't want or if I'm not using more those services, I might return back and I don't get charged for that. So it's major service. These are all characteristics of cloud computing. Now, the one of the most common question when we run these sessions are what is difference between elasticity versus scalability? So scalability is a operation where you can add more resources, and if you need more, you can add more and more. So let's suppose I have a demand of 5 servers now, or maybe a couple of GB of RAM, and then if I need more, I can increase more. And as demand increases, so that's a scalability. Whereas elasticity is I can scale as I need more, I can add more, but then I can come back as well and reduce down if I don't need that many resources. So this is typical problem. If you're doing things on-premise, you can scale up, but then if you try to go down, you've already paid for the customer for this hardware. You've already paid for the infrastructure. You've already paid for all the resources that you bought. So coming back from a scaling down is not an option in on-premise, whereas in cloud, you can both scale up and scale down. So that's a major difference between scalability and elasticity. Scalability, you can scale and increase, but then in elasticity, you can come a step back and then reduce these resources as well if you don't need it. So that's elasticity. Now, there's another concept people ask again is bring your own license, BYOL. So bring your own license depending on what service you're talking about. Some services have an option to bring your license. Now, what happens typically in when you buy services from cloud or on cloud, there are two types of pricing you pay for. One, you pay for the hardware part, meaning whatever resource like memory, CPU you use, you pay for that. Another one which you pay for the licenses. So let's suppose you're running a Windows Server 2012. So you'll be paying some license cost for that. Or if you're running on Microsoft SQL Server on cloud, you'll be paying some license fees for your cloud. If you already have those licenses bought for on-premise or you have licenses bought in another way, you can carry some of these licenses and to cloud, meaning you don't have to pay the license fee. You still be paying the hardware fee or the resource fee, but you're not paying the license fee. So that's an option called bring your own license. So if you look at here in SQL Server, if your normal pricing is $3.97 an hour, in that you will have a license fee of $3 and actual server on which running Windows Server probably will be 9.972. So if you bring your own license, you probably might be paying just this much amount, which is quite nominal fees because a lot of price is about license which you've already used or which you already have. Similar to that, there is a concept of Azure Hybrid benefit or Azure Hybrid where you can use these some services both on-premise and cloud. And that basically using your service licenses across some services you're using on cloud, some on-premise, and if you're not using on-premise, you can use on cloud accordingly. So that's hybrid benefit. And if you do, this is for virtual machine saving you do if you're running a Windows server, basically, depending on what operating system, some operating system doesn't even have, or some software doesn't have any license cost. But if you're running Windows server, you can save substantially if you're doing on bring your license. We are going to look at cloud service models. Now, there are 3 service models in cloud. One is infrastructure as a service, we call IaaS. Then second is platform as a service, which we call PaaS or PaaS. And then software as a service, which is SaaS. So let's first understand what are the difference between these 3. Now, this is a traditional on-premise or customer's data center on which you have servers when you look at in traditional on-premise deployment model, you have networking, storage, servers, virtualization, operating system, middleware, then you have runtime, data and application. Everything is the responsibility of client. You might have worked on this kind of environment. That's a traditional on-premise deployment model. Now comes the first service model, which is infrastructure as a service. And in infrastructure as a service, networking, storage, servers, and virtualization layer is managed by your cloud vendor. So virtualization, like, which gives you an option to create virtual machines where you have a one big server or a physical server. You create multiple small virtual machines running on top of that server. That's virtualization. And most of these companies, when you buy or say, I want a machine, they are giving you a virtual machine. So the underlying virtualization is managed by the cloud vendor. But anything above that, like operating system on that virtual machine, like you have an option to select Windows or Linux, that operating system is managed by you as a customer. Similarly, middleware, runtime, data, application, everything else on you see in dark here, that's managed by client. So that's infrastructure as a service. Then you have a platform as a service. In platform as a service, networking or everything that you were doing in infrastructure as a service, plus on top of that operating system, middleware and runtime, these are also managed by the cloud vendor. And then you as a customer will only manage data and applications. So one question comes is, what is this runtime here, or what is this middleware? So first of all, middleware is anything where your application logic runs. So anything between database tier, where your database runs, and the web tier, where your web servers run. Anything between them is a middleware or middle tier we call. And then any runtime on top of that. And runtime could be, for example, you have a Java development kit, JDK, or .NET runtime, or Python runtime, or you might have any runtime on which your application runs. So that runtime is all managed by the cloud vendor. You as a customer will manage only the data and application. Now the third is called as software as a service, in which everything is managed by the cloud vendor, and you as a customer will only have account and you use that service. You don't need to worry about what is the underlying operating system running, what is the whether application has a high availability, disaster recovery, who's going to manage that. You as a customer will not do anything. It's all done and managed by your cloud vendor. So that's three models: infrastructure as a service, software as a service, or platform as a service, and then software as a service. Now, a lot of guys come and say, oh, can you give us an example or between what is infrastructure as a service and platform as a service? And then we'll also look at what is the difference or what is an example of software as a service. So let's first look at difference between infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, or an example of infrastructure service or platform as a service. So traditionally, when you're deploying, what you do, you create a virtual machine. On that, you have a server. On top of that server, you install operating system. And then on top of that operating system, you install application. It could be database, it could be middleware, it could be a web server, it could be a runtime. And then on top of that, you deploy your application. So you manually doing all these tasks, which is creating a virtual machine, installing operating system, maybe during virtual machine creation, then installing applications on top of that and managing them manually. That's an example of infrastructure as a service. That's IaaS. Whereas platform as a service is where cloud vendor will take care of your operating system, your virtual machines, and the runtime. And in that runtime could be, as I said earlier, it could be a database service. It could be an app service. In this particular case, Microsoft Azure has an app service, and that app service will have different type of apps. You can create a mobile app, you can create API apps, you can create a web apps, which is a web server, and you can create a function, which is a serverless. And we'll look some of these things when we look forward into the compute module. So this is where you are running a web app. That's an example of platform as a service. You creating machine manually or through console and then installing applications on top of that, say infrastructure as a service. Now, another example of infrastructure as a service and platform as a service within database RTR or Microsoft Azure has three SQL database options, where SQL stands for Structured Query Language. And if you are part of our DP200, which is a Microsoft Azure data engineer, in that we go in detail about SQL database. We also touch base SQL briefly on Azure Solution Architect, because as a part of solution, you have to do the database part. So we cover migration and database overview of SQL databases. So SQL Structured Query Language, you have three offerings. One offering comes under infrastructure service and two other offering comes under platform as a service. Where in infrastructure service, you will create an operating system or a virtual machine, and on top of that, you install manually the SQL Server as you have been doing in on-premise. Or in platform as a service, you have two offerings, which means you don't need to manage or you don't create manually these machines. What you do is there's something called as managed server, which means Microsoft is going to manage the server on behalf of you. And that is Azure SQL Managed Service. You also have a Azure SQL database, and this is where you have a pre-provisioned or serverless compute, which means you don't even need to worry anything about the underlying operating system. Here you are getting a SQL managed instance, which is Microsoft is going to manage it for you. So these two offerings are platform as a service. This type of installing SQL database is infrastructure as a service. So that's an example of IaaS and PaaS. Then you have software as a service, SaaS. An example of SaaS is your Office 365, where you have Word, Excel, PowerPoint, email, Outlook, Link, all those services that you do in enterprise world. You buy a Microsoft Office 365 and all you're doing is you're downloading the license, not even downloading, you're buying the license. You don't need to worry about where exactly is hosted, managing servers, nothing. You're simply using the service. So that's software as a service. Another example of software service might be if you're using a paid version of Gmail. For our email accounts, we use Gmail behind the scene. So we only pay for the licenses or licensed users. We don't care about behind the scene, how the servers are, what the servers are, nothing. So that's an example of software as a service. So there are three deployment models. One is public cloud, then second is private cloud, and third is hybrid cloud, in which you can deploy your cloud or you can run your applications inside cloud in one of these three deployment models. Let's look for one by one. What are these? So public cloud is, as your name suggests, is available for public. Anyone can create an account and access this. Now, if you are going on to the Azure cloud and then creating an account, that's basically the public cloud. You can create an account. I can create an account. Like hundreds and thousands of users have their account on public cloud, where the underlying infrastructure is shared, and depending on how much I need, I use that. That's public cloud. So it's typically public cloud is offered by the third-party providers like Azure in this case. It could be Google, it could be AWS or Oracle or any third-party application of you running public cloud. Now it's available to anyone over the public internet. And later in this module, we are going to create an account on Azure. So that's where you will be able to see that account being, or you can also create an account on or start using public cloud. Now, scale quickly and conveniently, which means you can scale up on public cloud easily and quickly. That's public cloud. Then you have a private cloud, which is private cloud is offered only to the select customers over the internet or over the private internal network. So there is a dedicated pipe. There could be a dedicated pipe from a customer premises onto the private cloud. So that's private cloud basically. Or users can access it over the internet as well, like you do on public cloud. But in private cloud, it's only for selective users. No other users can't access that particular private cloud. So for this, what private cloud provides, it provides a greater security control, which means you know that no other person is using or no other company is using that particular cloud. It's only dedicated for that particular customer. And it requires a traditional data center, staffing and maintenance. So this private cloud sometimes also referred as cloud at customer, where you can bring the entire cloud hardware and as well as the underlying software which runs cloud tooling on customer premises. That's private cloud, and especially useful where you have tighter security controls. So some banks might say, oh, we're not allowed to take our data outside our this particular premises or data center or maybe particular location. In that case, you can have the cloud or at a private on to the particular location. Now, next slide, I'm going to talk about that Azure Stack Hub, and Stack Hub is an example of where you can have the entire cloud being shipped at customer premises. That's private cloud. And then the third cloud commonly is hybrid cloud, which is a combination of public and private, where you have some applications are running on public cloud, some on private cloud, and hybrid kind of environment where you have combination of both public and private. In this particular hybrid cloud, the responsibility is shared between both public between the um, you don't have full control, and some part is controlled by the cloud vendor, some part is controlled by you. Now, it helps maintain the tighter control over the sensitive data and processes, meaning what you can do is you can have your sensitive information in private cloud, but rest all non-sensitive, so not non-sensitive information on public cloud. Now, as name suggests, or as you can see that private cloud is for a particular customer or a dedicated customer, the pricing is higher. You have a little bit, you need a little commitment, maybe in terms of maybe a couple of years of subscription for that hardware and then cloud. And that private cloud might involve a little bit more or a little bit interaction at the early stage of when the deal is being signed. It's not like a public cloud where I can go and create accounts. So that's public cloud. Now, if you look at the example of hybrid cloud, there's a component called Azure Stack Hub, which provides to run your applications in an on-premise environment, but in provide the same kind of a service that you do in cloud, but in your data center, in customer's data center. So you have here right hand side, you see Azure Cloud, and then you have a Azure Stack Hub, which is in this particular case, you have the Windows server with a backup server, and that is using my cloud as a recovery here. But you can have some applications running on private cloud, which is Azure using Azure Stack Hub, and it doesn't need to be Azure Stack Hub. It could be an in AWS you have Outpost, in Oracle you have Oracle Cloud at Customer, and so on. So that is an example of a hybrid where application running on public. This is the right public and private cloud as well. And that connectivity can be on an ExpressRoute, which is a dedicated pipe. We're going to learn this when we cover networking. So that's hybrid model. We are going to look at accounts and subscriptions in Microsoft Azure. So this is a pictorial view of what is an account and what is a subscription, and within subscription, what are those resources. So first is account is a globally unique entity that gives you access to Azure services. And services in this case, Azure services are the one which you see here in the diagram. You have your database service, virtual machines, functions, storage, networking, anything that you can create is a service. That service comes under an account. And within account, you have subscriptions, and subscriptions are nothing but they help you in creating the segregation or separation for billing as well as some managing these resources. So I can have a account. So account is a global unique entity. So when I'm creating a login ID and password or account, actually I'm creating a free account on Azure or an account in Azure, that's an account. Account is a unique top level entity. Inside that, everything that I create in a Azure cloud sits. And within account, I can have subscription, and by default when you create an account and later in this module towards and we are going to create an account of trial account. In that trial account that we say, it automatically adds subscription called trial subscription or subscription, and then you can later add more subscription to that. We'll see that in a minute. So within an account you can have multiple subscriptions. In this case I have a dev subscription, test, and production subscription. So I can keep my services segregated, or I can use and say dev environment, all my dev environments will be under dev subscription, and this is my billing going to be. So that's what is account for. So subscription is a logical unit of services that is linked to an account. That's the definition of subscription, and these subscriptions help me for security and billing boundary. I can secure and restrict and say inside my subscription I can see my details. So this is a console view of my Azure account. Inside that I can see the subscriptions, and I can see on top right the accounts. Let me log in actually onto the portal and show it to you. So I've already logged into Azure portal, and this is how the home page of Azure portal looks like. When you come to the last mod or towards end of this module, we are going to I'm going to give you step-by-step instructions, including a step-by-step guide to create this account. So this is where this is my account, and that is basically you can view account. And this is an account. Within that account, I will have something called as subscriptions. So if you type subscriptions and click on that subscription, you will see here I have two subscriptions. One is a Azure PaaS, which is a free. You get Azure PaaS from Microsoft when you as a you can buy these Azure passes. Second is now Microsoft Partner Network, and this is you when you're a partner, Microsoft partner, you get these Microsoft Partner Network. And so this is my subscription. This is my account here, and this is my subscription. I'm using my colleague's account number here or the account here. Now, the account status can be active, disabled, or past due date, and there are different roles within these subscription. We'll see these roles when we look at identity and access management, depending on which program you're part of. You're part of solution architect. If you're part of Azure administration, we'll look at these roles and responsibilities. But one other thing which I wanted to tell you about is cost management and billing. And this is where you can see how much resources you've used, what money you have used. So inside that, you can go and check cost management on left hand side. You can also look at the subscription billing. So let it come. So this is where I can analyze and decide my costing. And this is where I'll see no, unless you upgrade your account to pay as you go model, Microsoft will never charge you for that for first 30 days, or after 30 days, you have to upgrade and say, I want to go pay as you go model. Now, unlike AWS, here first 30 days or $200 credit, whatever is first comes, that will be applicable. So if you've used all $200 credit within 30 or within 15 days, your account will be then limited and you won't be able to do much on that account. But you don't get charged anything for first 30 days unless you upgrade to pay as you go model. Whereas in AWS, you still get charged if you go above your service, and it lets you go, AWS lets you go over the limit, and there's no something called you have to upgrade to pay as you go model. AWS by default is you pay for that service. Unless it comes under free service, or that too for limited resources. Now you also have subscription type of pay-as-you-go model where you only pay what you use. Then there is an enterprise version of subscription, which will be a little bit more cheaper or a lot more cheaper compared to pay-as-you-go model, but you agree some or you sign some agreements with Microsoft that you are going to use this much credit in a quarter, in a month, or in a year. It's for a large scale, enterprise scale organization or big organizations. Then you have a student pass. And if you're a student with a student email address, you can have $100 for 12 months, but you must have a student access or verify your student access in order to achieve that subscription type. We are going to talk about Azure Cloud Services. Now I'm going to keep it high level, but later in this, we are going to go in detail about each of these services, but again, still at a high level. But then later, depending on where you're watching, you may be going deep into those services, depending on if you're a part of data engineer. As your data engineer DP 201 or 203, now we might be focusing on databases more and unstructured NoSQL databases. If you're part of more about machine learning or DP 100, it will be more machine learning, but otherwise in Azure administration, AZ 104, AZ solution architect 303, 304, we probably might be going deep into these services. So first is under the base of these services is a Microsoft's global data center infrastructure. They have data centers across the globe, and there are multiple something concept called region and availability zone. We'll cover that region, availability zone, and a fault domain, update domain a little bit later. But assume this is an infrastructure. In that first, there are core services we call or core infrastructure services, in which you have compute, which you see here, which is nothing but your CPU memory, something that you can use to do some processing. And in that you have virtual machines and containers. Then you have storage, and storage to store data, and there is a different type of storage. So you have a blob storage, which is a binary large object, I'm assuming, which is nothing but object storage. If you are familiar with the storage concept, object storage where you store your images, GIFs, videos, files, and so on. So blob. And then Azure Files, which is a file service like NFS compliant file service you have, that's Azure Files. Then you have a premium storage, different type of storage disk, also called as block storage, where you install your operating system. So that premium services, this is storage. Then you have a networking, and there are different networking services. You have a virtual network, which is nothing but your a big network, something similar to VPC if you're coming from AWS background, or like VCN, which is a virtual cloud network if you're coming from Oracle background. It has a load balancers, which balances the load and forward client requests to the multiple backend servers. You have DNS, which is a domain name service. You have ExpressRoute, which is a connectivity from on-premise to cloud. You have a traffic manager for diverting the traffic based on your requirement of a disaster recovery traffic manager across different sites. VPN gateway to connect from between on-premise to cloud, or between one cloud data center, one cloud region to another region. And then you have an application gateway, which is for the application layer 7 level on OSI model, the load balancer. Now, I have done a dedicated module on networking. So depending on if you're coming from probably as your solution architect, you should be seeing that dedicated networking module or networking for beginners, where we cover and tell you about these services a little bit more in detail in their own separate chapters. So this is core basic infrastructure services like your compute, storage, and networking. And just to show you up on the console, here I'm on a Microsoft Azure, and here you can go and look at virtual machines. So this is your VM where you have virtual machines, my compute, or I can go to containers, which is my container instance here, or Kubernetes. If you're familiar with Kubernetes concept, as your Kubernetes service. So that's my virtual machines. From storage, I can go in storage. There is a concept of storage account. Now you don't have different blob or other disk or and so on separately. There's a concept called storage account and a collection of your storage type. So you should have created an account. Once you create an account, within that storage account, you have something called as file share, tables, and queues. We'll look into tables in a minute, and queues as well. So this is a file share, and containers are not your microservices containers. Don't confuse that with microservice containers. This is a storage container, which is nothing but think of it as a box in which you can store the data. So it's a storage containers. So that's storage. And then from networking, you have VNet, which is virtual network. You have network interface cards. You also have subnets, which will be created inside VNet anyway. You have VPN gateways. You can have ExpressRoute. You have gateways, different type of gateways, and so on. This is networking. So that's our course infrastructure services. Then you have security and management service. We already saw the portal where we logged in, but you also have Active Directory, which is Azure Active Directory. So the implementation of Active Directory to store users, groups, authentication, authorization, and single sign-on. Your Azure Active Directory provides that. You have a multi-factor authentication, which means in order to log or like authenticate, you can have not just username password, but one more factor of authentication, like maybe SMS token in Azure services. You have automation, you have Key Vault for storing the keys, sensitive information like encryption keys and so on. And you have marketplace where you can have some applications. So you have security and management. Then you have integration services to talk to other systems like BizTalk, or queues, like you might have heard of JMS, Java messaging queues on the similar lines. You have service bus. You also have media and content delivery network, CDN, which is to speed up the internet speed of or store the static content of your websites on to something called as edge locations, which is closer to where user is accessing that data from. Then you have analytics and IoT, and these HD Insight, Data Factory, Stream Analytics, we'll cover that a little bit later when we go into these. And so all of these I'm going to cover one by one, these services later in this lesson or this module. So you have Data Factory, which is an ETL tool. HD Insight, your insight for analytics and so on. Machine learning, we'll talk in DP100. You have Event Hub and mobile management. Then these are all data related. You have SQL database, you have SQL data warehouse, which is now called as Azure Synapse. You have tables we saw just now here under storage account when we were looking. You have search, you have a Redis cache, which is a caching database. You have document DB, we'll see that as well as we go. And especially if you're part of DP200, 201, which is now DP203, we're going to cover that in detail. Then you have other different type of compute services like as well service fabric, which we'll see when we do web apps. Then you have mobile and web applications. And then you have developer services if you're DevOps or developer, which is Visual Studio, SDK, software development kit, or applications inside. And then you have hybrid for on-premise connectivity or for Azure Active Directory or connect with on-premise backup and recovery and so on. And these are some of the services are available. And this is, I've given you a very 30,000 foot view. We're going to go into some of these core services a little bit later in this, or maybe from next lessons, we're going to talk about IAM. That's when we'll start talking about these. So just to show it in your portal how these look like, and then we'll head on to the next lesson. So this is, I was talking about, we already saw compute core services, and then you can see Azure Active Directory. So you just search for Active Directory and you will see Active Directory here. And then it also has privileged identity management for Active Directory. You also have HD Insight. So this is for Hadoop Insight. Your machine learning as well are here. Your databases, your SQL database we saw earlier or mentioned that SQL database. And then you have machine learning. I think we already covered machine learning and so on. So these are some of the core services that you have. So let's first look at the first and important service, which is Identity and Access Management Service, or IAM service we call. The most important component in that Identity and Access Management is Azure Active Directory. So the Azure Active Directory is a cloud-based suite of identity and access management capabilities that enable you to securely access your Azure services. And there are different types of services you can securely access, and any other resources for your users who are trying to access cloud. It also provides authentication, authorization, device management, multi-factor authentication, and can also integrate with your on-premise Active Directory, or can also protect your on-premise resources as well. Now, one of the common question we get is it exactly similar as Windows Active Directory? And answer is no, it's not exactly same, but there are, if you see in the diagram, you will understand that both these Azure Active Directory and Windows Active Directory do your users and group management, authentication and authorization part. Where they are different is that Windows Active Directory, which is you do on-premise, also supports Kerberos and NTLM. Now, again, if you are not from a security background, you don't need to worry about Kerberos and NTLM, which are more for zero sign-on and other things. Whereas Azure Active Directory is more for authentication based on SAML, which is Security Assertion Markup Language, OAuth, OpenID, and Web Services Federation. These are all for authentication for web services and different type of protocols. These are all authentication authorization protocols, and these are used to protect your cloud-based applications. So that's what Azure Active Directory is being used, and it's available in your Azure account. Now, this Azure Active Directory can be used to protect your SaaS applications. It could be like for Salesforce, Dropbox, Oracle, SAP, any other cloud-based applications can be protected using Azure Active Directory. You can also use to protect your cloud-based services. So for example, you can integrate it with your AWS console or Google Cloud or Oracle Cloud or any other applications to integrate so that they can authenticate via a user in Azure Active Directory. You can also use it for integrating with on-premise legacy applications. You can also integrate with Active Directory on-premise, and I'll explain you in a minute how. You can also protect your on-premise resources like Workforce or Salesforce or any other application with Microsoft Azure Active Directory, which is on cloud. Now, there is a concept of called Azure Active Directory Connect. And if you're part of Azure Solution Architect or Azure Administration AZ-104 or Azure Solution Architect AZ-303, 304, probably might be going deep into this. But there is something called Azure AD Connect Server, which will be integrating your on-premise Active Directory with Azure Active Directory. That you can sync. And in both these trainings, we also have a hands-on lab if you're part of those trainings. Now, one question I get repetitively is how the Azure Active Directory is related with your subscription. So we saw earlier that there is an Azure account. That account can have multiple subscriptions, and subscriptions are used to or group your resources so that you can apply some policies or billing around that. So with each Active Directory, you can have multiple subscriptions, or a subscription is always associated with the Active Directory, but a subscription can only be associated with only one Active Directory, whereas a one Active Directory can have multiple subscriptions. And we're going to see you when we go inside the portal in a minute. So what Azure subscription does, Azure subscription has a trust relationship with the Azure Active Directory. So trust, or a subscription trust Active Directory, or Azure Active Directory, better to say, to authenticate users, services, and devices. So when you're protecting any application or resource that is inside the subscription, whatever subscription that is linked to the Active Directory, you can authenticate or you can protect your resources through that Azure Active Directory. So multiple subscriptions can trust same Azure Active Directory, whereas each subscription can only have or only can trust single Azure Active Directory. So that's a relation which people get confused. Again, if you're watching this as a beginner and if you're getting confused, nothing to worry about. Assume that this is just for your knowledge purpose. If you're part of Azure AZ500 or Azure Active Directory or Azure Solution Architect, we probably might be going deep into this. And this is how the Azure Active Directory on console look like. Let me directly connect to you there and then I'll show it to you. So this is I've logged into my Microsoft Azure Cloud portal. Now later at the end of this module, we are going to create a Azure Cloud account, and you'll be first creating a free trial account. I'll explain you how to do that. But here you search for Azure Active Directory, and this is where you have Azure Active Directory. Now within Azure Active Directory, there is a different licenses. There is a B2C, but I'm not going to cover that B2C or identity protection. For now, I'm just focusing on Azure Active Directory. You click on this, and this is where you see all your users, groups, and then if you want device management to protect your devices, you can see that as well here. And this is what I was talking about, Azure Active Directory Connect. To connect your with your on-premise Active Directory, you can sync that. So later, if you're part of, as I said, 104 or 304, 30304, we're going to configure this Active Directory sync. So this is where you will see all the users, and these are some of the users which we have defined in our account in here. Now, so this is my default Azure Active Directory, which is configured here. If I want to change my directory, I can click here and say switch directory, and it'll give me all the list of subscriptions. So with my by default, it's the directory which is configured is K21academy.com, and I can say I want to just with this particular one, I can say where exactly is this. So currently I only have one Active Directory controller. I can go and create more Active Directory as well. So I'll go and within an account, I can create a more Active Directory. And when I say create a tenant, that actually I'm creating an Active Directory, and I can link this Active Directory with a subscription. Now, I'm not going to do it here, but this is where just to show you how to create an additional Azure Active Directory on that. This is where you can create additional users, guest users, groups, or applications. And there are other things which you can do here on this Azure Active Directory. We are going to talk everything about compute services. And as I said earlier, compute is nothing but a set of processing, which is collection of your CPU and memory. And first and the most important thing you get, or first the most common one you get, is a virtual machine. So you can go and create different type of virtual machines or different operating system virtual machines. You can create a Windows server, or you can create different flavors of Linux, which could be Ubuntu server, Red Hat Linux, SUSE, or different Linux. Now, if you're creating a Linux machine, this is how the architecture is going to look like. The outer shell, you have a Azure Cloud. Inside that, you create something called virtual network, or VNet we call, which is nothing but a continuous block of IP addresses through which you get your IP addresses. Within that virtual network, you create something subnet, which is a subset of your virtual network. And within that subnet, you create virtual machines like Windows or Linux. And on top of that, you can install any application of your choice. There's a concept called network security group, which is nothing but firewall that you open. Now we are going to discuss about these networking later. And there is a dedicated separate module called networking for beginners, depending on you might have access to that, or if you want to go, if you enjoy networking, let my team know, and we can give you this bonus about networking for beginners that you'll enjoy. So this is how the virtual machine actually have or run on Azure. So this, why I said earlier, you have a outer layer, which I've added another concept called a resource group, which is nothing but collection of resources. And I think we covered resource group earlier, or maybe we're going to cover that in later. So resource group is a collection of resources. In this case, my virtual machine, network, load balancer, or my disk, all those are resources. So inside that, I've created a virtual network, then subnet, and this is my virtual machine. Now this virtual machine will need some data. So I can have some additional data, or my disk we call. So you can, by default, there'll be some default disk, which we call managed disk. And you can also create additional disks with that we call storage. And that's how you get virtual machine. Now in virtual machine, you can configure something called as network interface card, which will give you the IP addresses which are assigned to a virtual machine, and you can create multiple network interface cards. And if you create a machine with a public IP, you can access it over the internet. So that's in a nutshell about virtual machine. You can go and create virtual machines. I'll show it to you on in a console in a minute here. So let's go to the console and create, or show it to you how you can create virtual machines. So I'm back on my portal console. I'll type here virtual machine, and not virtual network, but virtual machine. These are the virtual machines. I've already have all these virtual machines running. So I'll quickly and say add, and say add a virtual machine. And I'm not going to explain it the different details here. We are going to, depending on which training you're part of, we probably might be giving or going deep in that particular training about this. But what I wanted to show you was that image will dictate what kind of operating system you want on that virtual machine. So you have Ubuntu, you have Windows, there are different type of Windows. You can have a Red Hat, you can have SUSE, you can have CentOS, Debian, Oracle Linux, or different flavor of operating system. And then the shape will, or size will dictate how much memory and CPU. And this is where, depending on size, I have different, how many CPUs and memory I can define on this virtual machine. And then rest all are different parameters. So this is how you go and create the virtual machines. So this is one of the compute, which is your virtual machine. Another compute type is Azure App Services. Now, just to understand, in order to understand app service, so earlier the virtual machine which we saw, that's part of infrastructure as a service, and we looked at IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS in one of the previous lessons. So there I said a virtual machine is part of IaaS, whereas app service is a part of platform as a service, or PaaS. And let me explain what I mean by that. So traditionally, when you need to deploy any application on a server, what you do is you get a server, you install operating system on top of that, you install then application server like IaaS or web server, something on top of that, and then you deploy your application. Now that means you need to manage multiple things. Now, what if Microsoft is going to manage everything? So Microsoft is going to manage your server, operating system, web server, or any underlying application server, and then runtime as well on top. And runtime, as I said earlier, is maybe could be your Java, .NET, Node.js, PHP, Python, HTML, or any container, which we'll cover that a little bit later. There's a separate section about container. I'll cover that later. So any runtime you do, that on top of that, you have ready for you, or Microsoft will give it to you, and all you need to do is create your or host your application on top of that. And depending on type of application, you could have a function, you could have a web app, you could have a mobile app, you could have an API application. You can host any of these applications, and Microsoft Azure is going to give you that runtime and the entire platform. So that's a Azure App Service. So Azure App Service is a HTTP based service to host your web applications, REST APIs, or mobile backend service. You can develop in any language of your choice. So developer will give you the application in whatever language of their choice. And then when you create the app service, you say, I want the app service with this particular runtime. So this is a on portal on look like. Let me directly connect to the Azure portal and it show it to you. So this is my Azure portal, and all I need to do is search for web apps or app services. I need to search for app service and click on this app service. And this is where I'll say that create a app service. And this is what I was talking about. If you scroll down on here, so first I need to select a resource group before I go any further. So I already have some resource group which I'll select. Now resource group is collection of resources. In this case, web app is a resource. My virtual machine is a resource. My network is a resource. And this is where I will be selecting my runtime stack. So is it a .NET? Is it a Java? Is it a Node.js? Is it a PHP, Python, Ruby? I can select any depending on the type of application. So I don't need to worry about server. I don't need to worry about installing any applications on or runtime on top of that. And that is an example of web app. So that's a second type of compute. Now, third type of compute is a function. So that's type of compute, which is web app. Now, another compute type is a function. We also called serverless. And you might have heard of functions or serverless quite a lot, but usually serverless or functions are actually used or solution for some small piece of code. So you might say, for example, you give an input and it gives you an output. So you can say 3 plus 3, you have a function called addition and you provide two details like 3 plus 2, two entries, and it'll give you output of 5. Another example could be, you might have heard of Alexa. You say, Alexa, what's time? And it'll execute that function and give you the time back. So that's something that runs for a very short duration of time so that you don't have to have the server ready all the time. And it's basically charged based on the execution or number of time that function is being executed. So you don't need to worry about having or scaling it up, or you don't have to worry about keeping server ready all the time. So functions are kind of a serverless, where you don't need to worry about servers. All you care about is running some piece of code, and that code will do whatever you ask it to do. Now that code can be written in C# or .NET, Java, Python, JavaScript. You can do any choice or any programming of your choice. And something similar you also, no, cut repeat, and then not something similar. So that's my function. And then you have another compute, which is of Azure Logic Apps. And Logic App is basically for scheduling, orchestrating your business processes. So you have a BPM, which you might have heard of, business process systems. So you say, if this happens, do this, or if this and this, do that particular thing. So that is where Logic App will come, where you need some workflow, you need something action to happen based on some conditions, or you have a business processes to execute those. Now, these are the two other services. Let me show it to you on our Azure portal. How do they look like? So I'm back on console. First, we are going to do is we'll type functions. So you have a function app. Click on this function app, and you say create my function. And like all other resources, you put them into resource group. You give a function name. This is what's talking about runtime. You can have a function written in .NET, Node.js, Python, Java, PowerShell, or any custom handlers. So that is about function. And similarly, you have logic app, and you can write big, good logic and say, if you do this, do that particular activity. So we'll say click on consumption. And this is where you will see or create all the first you'll create a logic app. Inside that you'll go and create some logic around that. So that's logic app. So your functions, logic app. Now next and the final part in this compute is about containers and Kubernetes. You might have heard of container Kubernetes microservices. Before I tell you Docker and Kubernetes, let me quickly tell you the background. So earlier till till I think probably 2014-15, you were deploying your applications on something called as virtual machines. Now, virtual machines is you have a physical server. On top of that, you install hypervisor. Now, again, I'm not going to go to detail because I want to keep it high level. Hypervisor is the one which will provide you necessary infrastructure to run multiple machines of different operating system on the same hardware. So on using a hypervisor, you can create multiple virtual machines and deploy your applications. But the challenge with that is that the virtual machines use a lot of disk space or a lot of CPU and memory, so they are very resource hungry. Moreover, the operating system itself takes a lot of time, and they take a lot of time to boot up, and they're not true for, or they're not perfect for the new world of deploying applications that's using microservices. And this is where the containers come handy. We call containers, where what you have is use a physical server or a virtual machine. On top of that, you install an operating system, and on top of that operating system, you have a container runtime. Like Docker is one of the container runtime. There are other container platforms as well, and on that container, you run multiple or on that container runtime, you run multiple containers, and each container will have a microservice with all its dependencies. So that's container or Docker. Now, the advantage with Docker or container, I'm using word Docker and container interchangeably, but Docker is one of the type of containers. You have different type of containers or different container options. Now, the memory and CPU and disk space usage, could repeat, sorry. The advantage with containers are that their storage is very minimal. The memory and CPU they use to run the operating or run that runtime is quite small. The footprint for that is small. The application might take a little bit more, or depending on how memory or CPU hungry that application is, but the resource it takes to run that application or underlying resources or operating system level resources are very light. Also, if you see the memory, it will be in MBs, and it takes few seconds or under a second just to start up containers. So that is the background of virtual machine and containers. Now, containers grew over a period of time, and in order to manage these containers, you need some container orchestration tool. And this is where this Kubernetes or K8s, where Kubernetes word has 8 letters in the middle. So you have Kubernetes. There are other container orchestration tools like Mesos or Docker Swarm are there, but Kubernetes is quite famous. And that gives us two things. One is container runtime, which is Docker, and a container orchestration tool like Kubernetes. And implementation of that container or Docker and implementation of Kubernetes on cloud or Azure cloud is your Azure container instance and Azure container service, Azure Kubernetes service respectively. So you have as Kubernetes implementation on Azure, which is Azure Kubernetes Service. The container implementation on Azure is Azure Container Instance or ACI. Now, these containers run using something called as images, and images are stored in a registry, which is called as Azure Container Registry. You might have heard of source code. If you're coming from a development background, you store your data, your code into a source code like Git or GitHub. Similar to that, your images through which your containers run are run using or are stored in Azure Container Registry or Container Registry. So these are the three options. You have Azure Container Registry to store containers, images. Your containers are the runtime of containers are ACI, and then management is using Kubernetes. So these are the three options you have, which is Azure Container Registry, Azure Container Instance, and Azure Kubernetes Service. Now, if you're part of Azure DevOps, AZ400, Azure Administration, or Azure Solution Architect, we probably will be going deeper into these topics. So this is my Azure portal, and this is where I'll going to say first Azure Container Instance or Registry. So your registry, the one which you said Azure Container Registry, you will search for registries and you see container registries, and you can go and create a container registry. I already have a container registry which we created for DP100. Again, DP100 is for data science, and data science workload can run on containers, and there's the images for that container runtime are stored here. Similarly, if I see container instances, so this is my container implementation on Azure, which is my Docker containers. I can start and I can quickly start my containers here. Similarly, I'll go and now this is where my container. In order to start the container, you use an image, and in this case, I'm using an image which is a default image, which can come from different sources. Which in this case, if I need to pick it from my Azure Container Registry, I'll select it here. Now, third one, as I said, is Kubernetes. So I'll collect and say Kubernetes service, and I'll click on Kubernetes, and I can create a Kubernetes instance on cloud. Now, what is Kubernetes? It's a big topic on itself. Again, we have a dedicated separate program which is called as Docker and Kubernetes, where we cover certified Kubernetes administrator certification, which is from Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNCF. But whatever you need to run Kubernetes on Azure, you'll be looking at in the respective program depending on which program you are part of. We're going to look at network services. Now, networking is an interesting topic and it could be quite complicated as well. Now, I'm going to keep it high level here, but if you're part of Azure Solution Architect, we are going to go a little bit deeper onto this networking diagram, and you can ask for a more in-depth networking for beginners, where we go and discuss a lot more detail around 10 or 11 lessons in that module or bonus class, where we go and deep about networking one by one and go a little bit bigger. So this is how the big network look like, and these are different connectivities and everything in a when you deploy your application on cloud, you or someone who's a network engineer or an architect will design the networks. And what I mean by that network, this is what I'm going to explain, where you have some databases running, your virtual machines running, you have a load balancer. So this is a 3-tier architecture where you have a DB tier, app tier, and a web tier. You might have a Bastion host. I'll explain you what that as well in a minute. And then you can also might want to connect this whole cloud with your on-premise connectivity. So what are these different options and how do you access, which will cover or explain all of this in this network here or diagram here. So what you have is you have an outer Microsoft Azure cloud, outer which is representing cloud. In that, first thing you do is create a network. And network is nothing but a continuous block of your IP addresses that is being used by your virtual machines, load balancers, database servers, or anything that needs an IP address will be taking IP address from that network. Now, this network is also used to so that your machines can talk to each other, or machines in cloud can talk to each other. So there's a concept called VNet or virtual net we define. Again, as I said, probably in the respective modules, we might go deep depending on which training you're part of. So you have virtual network, and in that you define or you create different subnets. So you might have database tier in which you define your you keep all your databases. So I create one subnet. Inside that, we create a DB tier. Then I'm going to create a SQL database or Azure SQL database on that. And I might create that Azure SQL database as either a paid for managed service, or I might say I want to install a virtual machine in that network and I'll manually install my database on top of that. So that's database tier. Then I might define a apps tier. So another subnet for apps tier, and then deploy my virtual machines and app on top of that. Then I'll probably define a web tier in which I'll have my load balancers. I might create some virtual machines and deploy my manually my web servers here as well. Now, all this, if I want to access them, all of them machines, depending on what kind of a virtual machine it is. If it's a Windows machine, I might have to open up port number 3389. Or if it's a Linux machine, I might have to open port number 22 because these services listen on that particular port. So, but then 3389 or 22 port number may not be secure. A lot of companies don't allow these ports. They only allow 443, which is on HTTPS, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, securely, HTTPS, and that listens on port number 443. So what Microsoft have done is Microsoft have also defined another service called Bastion host or a jump box. So instead of going directly to these machines as an administrator, I'm currently jumping onto the Bastion host, which is also called as jump box, over port number 443, and I'm doing it through my Microsoft Azure portal. And then once I'm in this jump box, I can then connect from this machine. I can connect all of these machines um, on securely. So that's one option. Now, if I have my end users, they want to access my application, for them, I'm going to define a load balancer, and my load balancer will be again listening on securely 443. This is for my HTTP traffic. The other traffic which I did earlier was for my connecting to the virtual machines as an administrator. This will be used by administrators, this particular line. They will come to the load balancer, and load balancer will then forward that request to my app server. I'm assuming my app server is listening on port number 8000. And from there, I'm saying allow the connection from my apps tier to my SQL database server or wherever my database is running. And these little here are firewall or network security group. And we drill a hole and say allow my port number 443 from the internet on for load balancer. Then for this particular subnet, allow only port number 8000 from, and that too only from this particular subnet or this load balancer machine. Similarly, from SQL database, allow only port number 1433 from this particular subnet or this particular VM. We can restrict. So this is, we are doing everything on cloud. But what if I want to connect with on-premise? So in order to connect my this cloud with on-premise or in my customer data center, so that my this network which is on Azure cloud is merely an extension to my on-premise or my customer data center network, so that a machine here can talk to the machine here securely, but on a private IP rather than public IP. So I don't need to go um, in an unsecure manner. So for that, you have something called as a tunnel or gateway. You connect with on-premise using two methods. One is VPN gateway or second is ExpressRoute. Now VPN gateway, your data is moving securely over the internet, but there's a dedicated tunnel or pipe between these two networks. ExpressRoute, on the other hand, is a bigger dedicated pipe which is only open between your customer data center and Azure, and it's not available to the public. So you have a dedicated bandwidth over there. But ExpressRoute is slightly expensive. So this is in a nutshell about the load balancer you do. Now there's other advanced things you can also do, or which I'll explain. But as I said, I have explained all these things in detail where we go and explain what is VNet, what is subnet, gateways, firewall, load balancers, VPN, what is Bastion host, VPN gateway in detail in the respective module in another bonus called networking for beginners. That's for my Azure Solution Architect team members. So that will help if you're Azure Solution Architect, it will help you to understand this because that's your primary role. Now, one more thing which I wanted to highlight here is that within a Azure network, this is my VNet. I might have DevOps services, so I might deploy DevOps services externally. I might have SQL databases, might be you might want to define them externally from this VNet. You can do that as well. But there's another service called AppGate, your WAF, which is for Web Application Firewall, or your application gateway, which is a layer 7 load balancer. Again, if you're not from a networking background, if you don't understand, don't worry. This is just to give you an option that this is another typical network connectivity where you connect, your customers connect through the internet using WAF, which is a web application firewall, and they access through layer 7 load balancer, which is application gateway. And then your applications are over here. For on-premise, your employees, they connect through the VPN gateway through either a ExpressRoute or site-to-site VPN. Again, what these are in dedicated modules. So that's about networking for users. If you want to create VNets, subnets, you can simply go and on the cloud and say create a VNet, and then inside that you create these subnets. We are going to look at storage service. This is Atul from team K21academy. In the previous lesson, we looked at Azure Network, and let's continue from there about storage service. Now, there are primarily three types of storage that you see. One is object storage, that's in the form of blob. Then you have a block storage, that's in the form of disk. And then you have a file storage, which is Azure File Service. There's a fourth storage category which Microsoft Azure says, which is queue, which is like you might have heard of messaging queues or message queues or JMS, Java message queue or Microsoft message queue, which is a reliable queue method. So this is you have, but apart from that, three standard storage you might have be aware of. Object storage, which is for unstructured data for large objects, things like your images, JPGs, files, backups, anything that you put like movies, etc. So that's stored in Blob, which is a object storage. Now, file server is a you might have heard of file share or SMB or NFS file share. Those you can mount on over the network or across different servers using a NFS network file share protocol. So that's file server. And then you have a disk, which is a block storage. You have the data being written in block, which probably you need it when you attach a virtual machine to that, or you might be installing databases that need storage. That is where you have a disk, which is a premium disk, high IOs, and can be attached to the virtual machine. So these are the main categories of storage. Now, in Azure, there's a concept of Azure storage account, which contains all of your storage data objects like your blob, file, queues, tables, disk, everything that you create as a underlying storage that goes inside a storage account. And the storage account you provide you a unique namespace or unique name for your storing your data, which can be accessible from anywhere over HTTP or HTTPS protocol. Now, the data in this Azure storage account is durable, which means Microsoft will copy or have the multiple copies of these data, which automatically will be backed up, and the chances of getting any corruption are almost none of those, or almost none for these. That's highly durable. It's highly available, which means Microsoft will keep multiple copies depending on type of general account you keep or a storage account you create. And it's massively scalable, which means you can add a lot. Now, there are different categories of storage account. When you create, you will be getting these storage account. So you can go to Azure account and then say create a storage account. And inside that storage account, you will type or select storage account kind, and that will dictate whether it's a general purpose version 1 or version 2, or file storage account, or you have a blob storage account only. So you can create multiple storage accounts here. And then you can also select a replication, which means where do you want to replicate? You don't want any replication. You want to replicate within data centers. You want to replicate across availability zone or across region. Now, what is this region availability zone? We're going to see that shortly. So these storage accounts are accessible through different protocols. So if you have a queue, we also have another storage type called table, which will have the normal. This is not your relational database table. It's like a standard table type of storage account you need. You have a blob storage, queue storage, or table storage. These are accessible over REST API. You also have a file or disk storage that you usually attach to your virtual machine. So your virtual machine, if that needs additional storage, you can attach a disk storage, which is your block storage, and you have also file storage, which is NFS file server. So this is an example of virtual machine with storage, where you have virtual machine and you can then add additional disks coming from your storage account. And within your storage account, you have a standard storage, which will give you blob, table, file, or queue. You also have a premium storage, which will give you the virtual machine disk VM. So that's about storage on account. Again, as I said, depending on which program you are, you might be creating, if you're part of Azure Data Engineer, you might be creating some Azure storage account. Or if you're part of Azure Administration, Solution Architect, we'll be seeing them, or DP100, which is data science, you might need some data store. That's where we'll look at storage account. So that's storage account. We are going to look at data platform or Azure Data Services, or mainly target for Azure data engineers or Azure DBAs or database administrators. So this is mainly targeted for certification DP200 or Azure Data Engineer DP200 or DP900. So let's first begin with the different data types. Now there are three main categories of data type. You have a structured data, which is also called as a relational data or SQL data store, which is a structured query language where you have rows and columns, and data is stored in tables in form of rows and columns. Then you have semi-structured data where you have, I'll cover that semi-structured data example, but you have some structured but not exactly like tables and table in a rows and columns. That structure might be JSON file, that structure might be a XML file, that structure might be a YAML file or a sensor data which is a little bit semi-structured basically. That's, and then you have a unstructured data which could be your images, GIFs, files, video, audio, and so on. So that's unstructured data. So here are some examples of structured, unstructured, and semi-structured. So structured data is what you see in left-hand side, which is your rows and columns stored in a table. Then your unstructured data is example is your text data, a Word document, PDF, notepad, video, audio, image, and so on. And then semi-structured is your XML format, which has some schema, but you define what schema. It could be a Java script object notation, JSON or XML or YAML or sensor data, whatever data in a format that you define. Now, depending on these data type, you have different data stores. So for structured data, Azure has Azure SQL, and those Azure SQL database comes in two flavors. One you see left hand side is an infrastructure as a service where you create a virtual machine and install SQL database on top of that, the way you do it in your on-premise or customer data center. Then you have two flavors of SQL database. One is Azure SQL Managed Instance and then Azure SQL Database. Again, if you're part of our DP 200, 201, which is now DP 203, we're going to discuss in detail about it. So this is a SQL Server option, which I said you have a SQL Server in a virtual machine, you have a SQL Managed Instance, and you also have the SQL Database Server, or which is your SQL database here, which is comes in single or elastic pool. Again, this is to give you high level. If you're part of, as I said, in our Azure Data Engineer, we'll be going deep into this database service. So that's for your structured data. Then you have semi-structured data where you have a Cosmos DB, which is a globally distributed multi-model database service, which gives you an option to access it over the normal SQL or MongoDB or Cassandra or Azure Tables or Graph. You have all these options available with this Cosmos DB. Then you have a table store. We also saw this when we were looking at in a storage account. So you have a storage account in which you are saying, for example, table storage, you have a table of customer and that will have some value key value pair. And then similarly, you have multiple tables with a key value pair. So it's a NoSQL database, ideal for storing structured or non-relational databases data on for table. Then you have a Azure Data Factory, which is a ETL, extract, transform, and load. So you have some data that you need to basically load into different system. It can be used for that purpose. So you have, for example, a CSV, which is stored in your Blob object, which is a storage account, and then you have to push it into the SQL Server. So you can use Data Factory. Or you have a data in on-premise, which is customer data center, and you have to store them into SQL database or maybe some other database. So the Data Factory is mainly for ETL kind of a workload. You also have a Azure Data Lake, which is for unstructured data. You have a big data kind of a workload. So that you might have heard of a HDFS, Hadoop file system. So that kind of when you need a big, huge data lake or a huge amount of data, that is where data is coming from multiple sources. You put it into the store, which is called as Microsoft Azure Data Lake, which can then be accessed over different options like HD Insight, which is a analytics and reporting. You have a different type of analytics or Hortonwork or Cloudera and so on, where that can work with Azure Data Lake. So these are all the database options or data store options, which is you have storage account. We saw in the storage, you have data lake, which is used when you have when you need a low cost, high throughput data store which is for NoSQL data with unlimited storage for data lake. Azure Data Break, this is for a Spark-based cluster, which enables fast processing of machine learning solutions. So if you're part of DP 100, we're going to look at Azure Data Break over there as well. Then you have Azure Cosmos DB, which is a globally distributed for structured and unstructured data store we saw earlier, which is like millisecond query response time. Azure SQL Database is a relational data store, which is mainly for used for transactional workload. You have a Synapse, which is a data warehouse, which is again relational data, but for data warehouse and analytics workload. You have Azure Stream Analytics, which is an event processing engine. So where you have a lot of data coming and it's processing on as the data is coming. Azure Data Factory, as we said, will orchestrate the batch movement, the data from one system to another in batches. You have Azure HD Insight, which is a low cost, high throughput data store when you need to store a NoSQL type of data. Azure Data Catalog, which is mainly for documenting what kind of a data types you have. So documenting your data stores, Azure Data Catalog. So these are all the data store options that you have. And that's pretty much all about data or Azure data engineers or targeted for Azure data, anyone who's working on data. So data platform service or data service on Microsoft Azure. We are going to look at data protection or maybe potentially a disaster recovery site. We'll talk about that or understand what options are you have for the data backup or data protection. So there is a service called Service Vault or a recovery service vault that you see here that can be used for backup and restore purpose. So let's suppose you have an on-premise or in your data center, you have files and folders that you want to do the backup, or you have a complete virtual machine for that you want to take the backup. Instead of keeping that into on-premise or in your customer data center, you can put that backup into the Microsoft Azure cloud for backup purpose. So there is a service called Recovery Service Vault in which that can be used for data protection or for backup and restore destination. So what you typically do, you configure a Recovery Service Vault in your Azure subscription, and then you download the agents and there's something called as credential file and an agent file that you pick up these from Recovery Service Vault, copy it and download them and install these agents on the on-premise and register these agents with your Recovery Service Vault, and then you can configure the backup so that any backup goes onto the cloud and you can recover these or restore when required. So that's Recovery Service Vault for backup and restore of your files and folders in on-premise. Similarly, you can also do the VM backups, entire VMs. So you have the virtual machine, you can take a snapshot of the virtual machine. Again, if you're part of, depending on Azure administration, solution architect, or some other training, you'll be taking up the backup of the VM. You can take the snapshot of the VM. Our snapshot is the at that point, what is the state of that VM? It will take that as a backup and will keep it. That backup or that snapshot can be stored in a recovery service vault. So let's first look at how does recovery service vault look like, or where do you see that? So you come under your Azure portal and search for a recovery vault or recovery service vault. So this is the recovery service vault. You need to go and create a service vault, and then you will see the different configuration options available. So right now you can create it, and then you can use this recovery service vault to create backups or virtual machine backup. So that's for VM backup. And then you have a Azure Site Recovery. You can create a complete disaster recovery covering everything right from your database to the application tier to your web tier and everything. So for this setup, you will be configuring two regions which are which can be paired, and I'll explain you what is a regional pair or what is pairing of or pair of regions consist of. We'll cover that a little bit later, but assume you have a site which is highly available on this, which is in one region. You have database being replicated between your apps tier is available HA active. The data is stored for apps tier in disk. Your web tier, which is data, which is a non-persistent data because it's a web tier of web traffic. You have a load balancer configured. Everything is available here. What you'll be doing is you can create a second region or second site as a disaster recovery site where the database you'll be doing configure is a replicated multi-master replication or maybe a read-only replication which is constantly replicating the data or database level. Your disk storage are replicated. Your virtual machines, if you want, you can replicate or copy the data as well here. And you have the two load balancers separately. And there is something called as traffic manager. You have the traffic manager will be forwarding requests to this side, and if this side is not available, forwarding it to this side, failover if this fails over. So that's also you can configure as your site recovery part. So that's for data protection and data or backup and restore of data, virtual machine, and the entire site. We're going to look at monitoring service and we'll keep it high level so that you understand. And then later in the respective program, we'll go deep into these topics. So there's a Azure Monitor service, which will be which is used for monitoring all your application, operating system, Azure resources, subscriptions, tenants, or any other custom sources. You can bring all the data from and put it into a repository, which will have all the metrics as well as logs. And from these metrics and logs or from this store, you can integrate them using or you can use or integrate with Event Hub, Logic Apps, or you can ingest and export APIs. You can use APIs on these stores or monitoring stores. You can respond, you can create alerts, you can configure auto scale for this. You can analyze these logs through metrics or log analytics, or there's a metrics explorer in the console itself of Azure. You can have a look at that. You can also visualize these metrics and logs through dashboards, views, Power BI, which is a BI tool on Azure, or normally as well with on-premise as well, and you can create workbooks. And finally, you can get some insights related to your application or containers, Kubernetes, or virtual machines or monitoring solutions. So all this is available via the Azure Monitor service. So you need to create, or let me show it to you in console. So you search here monitor, and this will give you all the monitoring related dashboard. You can look at monitoring of storage accounts, applications. There's something called as, or this is for your monitor and visualize, query and analyze logs, or setup, or you can create alerts as well. And then these are different services for which you can configure these. So this is the monitoring service. Then you have alerts, or you can create new alerts so that if a particular action happens, you can email it or send the SMS alerts or messaging. You can configure, or you can view them on the dashboard itself. Within this, you also have log analytics, which is a tool on Azure portal to edit and run long queries from the data collected by monitor log. So this is where you collected the data logs, and you can run the analytics or these log analytics so that and interactively analyze these results from this log analytics. So you have, what you do is you create go to Azure portal and you create a log analytics workspace which will have the repository for your logs. So you have the data coming from multiple sources. You have a virtual machines with the agent installed. You have on-premise data where you have all the agents which are pushing the data onto your log analytics service, storing the data into the repository. You might be having data coming from Azure storage, and then you're running that analytics server to analyze the logs. Just to show you how does it look like. So you go to Azure portal and search for log analytics, and you're creating this log analytics workspace. And then once you create a workspace, then you can do some your analytical tasks on your log repository. You configure the different sources and you can run other things. We're going to look at Azure security. Again, I'm going to keep it high level so that you understand a broad overview, and then later required on respective modules, we can go deep into these topics. So Azure security involves security across end-to-end, right from data to physical security. And in that, there's a shared security model where some responsibility lies with Microsoft for security and some lies with you as a customer. And we're going to talk in the context of the service model that we discussed earlier, which is infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. So let's first look at the outer layer is a physical security, which means physically data centers, which are all protected by Microsoft Azure. They have a very strong security in terms of parameter, all secure. No unauthorized person can walk in, and they have a lot of control around that. Then you have identity and access management, and then you have a perimeter, which means around the cloud bubble that you have. Then you have a network level security where we saw you had firewalls at a network level. Then you have a compute level security where you have virtual machines or different type of compute. Um, they have their own or options, they have their own security. Then there is a security at application level where application itself is protected by authentication and authorization. And then finally, the data which your application is hosting, that itself will have its own security policy. Now, there is a from a security point of view, you have data at rest, which is all you can configure it encrypted. By default, it's all encrypted by the Azure managed keys, but you can configure customer managed keys as well. So data at rest. Another one is where you have a data in transit, where when anything that you access from a data point of view, which is also encrypted, you can configure all of that encrypted. By default, it's all configured to be encrypted. Now, with respect to the security in shared security model, if you are in an on-premise world, everything will be or responsibility of the customer. Whereas if you're in an infrastructure service, Microsoft will be protecting till your physical host on which your virtual machines are running. And from because in infrastructure service, virtual machines layer is all managed by Microsoft. So security is responsibility of Microsoft till virtual machine layer. But after that, operating system and above, everything is managed by customer. So it's responsibility of customer for these for security. Similarly, in platform as a service, the till operating system, because operating system is also managed by the Microsoft, then it's all Microsoft responsibility. But network controls, application level control, and directory or identity infrastructure is co-managed, which means some responsibility lies with Microsoft, some responsibility lies with customer, and hence it's a shared security model in this category. But anything about account and access management, endpoints to customer, and data governance, it's all responsibility of customer in platform as a service. When it comes to software as a service, which is all like Office 365 and so on, application is also protected by Microsoft, or responsibility of application protection is also Microsoft, whereas identity directory infrastructure, meaning integration with identity and access management is or shared responsibility model. But anything at the application level, like who has that password and you're protecting your username passwords properly, it's all customer responsibility. So this is a shared security model or security model that some responsibility lies with customers, some with Microsoft, and some areas where they co-share the responsibility. Now, within Azure, from a security point of view, there's the Azure Security Center that will basically tell you the score or security score on your cloud-based applications. It'll give you the hygiene of your resource security, threat protection. There's a firewall, which is a firewall, which is different from your network level firewall. This is the application level firewall you can put and you can configure. There are a lot of other things you can do on this. Let me show it to you on cloud. How does it look like on inside Azure portal? How do you access Security Center? And you can, some things come out of the box, some things you have to protect or configure. So if you are on Azure portal, here you will be searching for Security Center, and you'll be do the security center. There's security baseline you can create, and you have firewall and other things which you can do. There's another service which is called as firewall manager to manage your firewalls. You have firewall policies. This is the firewall, and also you have a DDoS, distributed denial of service attack protection, that you can configure. So we are clicking on security center, and this is where you will see the uh, like it's showing me that what is my security score. So I have around 17 unhealthy resources which I need to be protected. I can put Azure Defender. This is my firewall manager, and there are other security settings or configurations which are available here. So that's about security in Azure. We're going to look at migration service and data transfer service. So if you look at migration, there are mainly um, two main things that you migrate. One is you have uh, your databases that you migrate, and then you have your virtual machines that you migrate. So you in order to migrate your database, there is a separate database migration strategy, and depending on what kind of a database you go on the cloud and what you have on-premise, you might be using different options. But there's a service available which is called as Azure Database Migration Service. You can use that to migrate databases. Now, for virtual machines, you have an option of using a Azure VM Migrate, which we're going to cover here. And then you also have a Azure Site Recovery, where your on-premise becomes one site and the cloud becomes a second site. So depending on the type of applications you have on-premise, you can also use site recovery to migrate your data and applications from on-premise to cloud. Now, in order to migrate your virtual machines, whether it's a VMware based workload or Hyper-V based workload, which is from Microsoft, you have two options to migrate. One is called as agentless, and second is agent based. So in agentless, you are migrating your Hyper-V or VMware on a HTTPS channel to migrate to Microsoft Azure. Or you have an agent base where you install an agent, and then you have something called as configuration server, which is a centralized management server which you'll be using to migrate your services. Within that centralized configuration server, you have a process server which is used for caching or compression or encryption of all the data. And then so all the data will be going from here onto the central system configuration, and that will be using acting as an agent, will be forwarding then request onto all the data onto the Microsoft Azure. So there's an agent-based migration. And in Azure Solution Architect, we'll be covering these migrations in detail. Then there is a data transfer service, and data transfer service is mainly used if you have a huge amount of data that you don't want to send it over the internet or over the network. So you can one option is you can send the data via the network, which means you have between your on-premise, which is a customer data center, to cloud, you can have a VPN gateway, which is a data over internet. And second option is you have an ExpressRoute, which is a dedicated bandwidth or a high bandwidth pipe between your customer data center and cloud. Now that is over the network, but if you have terabytes of data, if you have like suppose 50 to 100, 200 terabytes of data, sending it over the network might be very time consuming. So what you can do, you can have a disk appliance through which you can use that to ship the data. So you have what you do, you create a job. So you have an import job to move large amount of data to Azure Blob storage or files. Or you can have an export job to move large amount of data from Azure storage to the on-premise. So if you're going from an on-premise to cloud, you can create an import job. So Microsoft will ship you the appliance which is encrypted, and it's quite safe. You load all the data into that appliance, ship it to Microsoft site, and Microsoft engineer securely will copy it into the Blob, which is your object storage, and then you can use it in your Azure cloud. Similarly, if you have a large amount of data on Azure, you can export that job from Blob onto the appliance, and then appliance can be shipped to you, back to you. So that's your export import job. So this is where the flow of export import. So this is flow of import job and this is flow of export job, where again, I'm not going to go into these. I want to keep it high level, but you can read or you can pause this slide here and you can read on this particular thing. If you have any questions, doubts, you can ask in our WhatsApp group. We'll be happy to help and assist you. Now, in order to ship these data from appliance, you have something called as data box. That's what the terminology Microsoft uses. Something in you have Snowball in Azure, in AWS, in Oracle you have data appliances. So you ship those data appliances. Now you have an option as I was saying data to be online, but there's something called as gateways. You have which is a virtual appliance. You keep that appliance onto the on-premise, and that will be shipping the data onto the cloud, Azure cloud through that appliance. Or you have an offline where you have a data disk of 8 terabyte, 100 terabyte, or up to 1 petabyte. If you have up to 1 petabyte, you have a heavy lot of data you can put into, you can request for a 1 petabyte disk, which will be shipped by physically by a courier company, and that will be moved into the Azure data center. So that data box. We are going to look at tools for Azure DevOps, and where DevOps stands for development and operations. So what has happened over a period of time is that in typical software lifecycle, you plan the development part, and then your developers code it using whatever development tool they use, and they store that code into a code repository, which could be Git, Jira, or Confluence. Then your build team will build that tool or build that particular piece of code in and create a artifact that can be generated into a deployable unit. Then your testing team using Selenium or JUnit or different tools will test it, and then a release team will deploy or release that code into an environment. That tool could be manual, that could be Jenkins, CodeShip, and so on. Now you deploy these things on a, as we saw in one of the previous lessons on compute, which could be virtual machine, Docker, or here AWS is just a reference, but in Azure Cloud and so on. Then you operate or manage that using something called Ansible or Kubernetes or Chef or any of these configuration management tool. And then finally you monitor them using Nagios or Splunk or Datadog and so tool. So this is where your two teams, which is development and operations, working together as a single unit. And this is a typical software lifecycle with a very open source kind of a tools that are available here. Now, something similar on Azure has a Azure DevOps tools, where you use Azure board to plan your development cycle, to discuss who's doing what work, what are the business requirements, etc. that you've done via Azure board. Then you have Azure repositories or repos, and that repos is basically to store your code. Once the code is stored, you have Azure pipeline, which is to automate your CI/CD build. So where as soon as someone store the code or your developer submit the code into the code repository, a build can kick in, and that build can then generate the deployable artifact and then deploy it on the server. So that's Azure pipeline. You have a test plan, your testers can use those test plan. And then Azure artifact is when the code which is there is being built, that will generate some artifact. So it will create the packages so that they can be deployed using Azure pipeline. So that is a whole CI/CD tool mechanism we call. So what will happen typically in DevOps cycle? Your engineers will be developing the code using any IDE, integrated development environment of their choice. Might be Visual Studio, might be Java tool, or any tool of their choice, and they will store the code into code repository, which is Azure Repo. From there, your testers will it will be deployed on a server, and then your testers will be testing it. Once they tested it with the test plan, it's being before your testers can test it, your testing team, or before it can be deployed or tester team test it, uh, your test team will be writing the test plans. And then through the test plan on a unit testing being done, once that's done, they might go through the Azure pipeline, which is automating this from Azure from here all to the way they are uh, deployed on a your whatever compute you are deploying on. It could be virtual machine, it could be containers, it could be web apps, and so on. From there, the output or insights will go, how this application behaving will go onto the insight, and your engineers will pick up any changes, issues, or something from application insight. Your engineers will also be checking Azure board for any new features, functionality, bug fixes, or other things they need to do. So that's a whole end-to-end DevOps cycle on Azure Cloud. Now there is a separate portal that you use in DevOps, and again, if you're part of AZ400, we are going to go deep into these topics. So you have dev.azure.com. From there you have Azure boards, repos, pipeline, test plan, artifacts. You configure them, and then there's the other part. This is more for development and CI/CD team, and there's an operations team which will have the other tools which we cover later, which is like automating ARM templates, Azure Resource Manager, and so on. So this is the dev tools, and this is the whole CI/CD, which were called continuous integration, continuous delivery, which is mainly for CI/CD. So you have developers developing code and building it. That's agile development. Every maybe short sprints, they are developing every week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks sprint, developing a functionality, which is agile development. Then these are integrated and tested in an integration environment, which is called as continuous integration. Then it's being released on a dev test environment, and that is continuous delivery. And then it's once it's tested, everything happens, then it's being deployed on a production environment. That's a continuous deployment. Once this testing phase is over, it continuously deployed on production environment. And then it's your ops team managing this. That's a whole end-to-end DevOps process. That's CI/CD, continuous integration. And this is a complete CI/CD Azure DevOps tool. And I explain you, but this is where, assuming you have a dev environment, QA environment, and a production environment, and left hand side is where you Azure board for requirement gathering. What developers have done here is they're developing these applications on a Visual Studio, and the code goes into a Git repository. As soon as the code goes into repository, a build process, which we call Azure build pipeline, the CI part of that build will run some job and will generate a artifact, and that artifact will be stored in Azure artifact. Then once the build is done, it will trigger a deployment or CD part, and that build will pull the artifact from Azure artifact and will deploy into to the dev. So from the dev stage, it will deploy on the dev server. Once it's tested and approved, then it will deploy to the QA environment through the QA stage. Once the approval are done and it's successful, it then gets deployed onto the production. Now production, it's deployed on a something called as blue-green deployment model. Now I'm not going to cover this here, but you have two identical slots where you have one slot is acting as a live production, and second is the one which you need to update and which will run new code. So this CI/CD tool will automatically deploy into the new production environment, which is the new version. Once it's tested, the blue-green deployment model will automatically swap, or you tell and you can swap the URLs. URL will still remain same. It will swap from here to this environment here, or the new version of the copy. So that is a blue-green deployment that we call. So this is done using Azure DevOps. This is the whole DevOps cycle in a multi-environment models. Again, if you're not from Azure DevOps background, which is totally fine. If you are attending Azure DevOps, this is what you'll be doing. One part of that, or 50 to 60% task is this, and then there'll be ops part or management part. If you're not part of Azure 400, which is Azure DevOps, this knowledge will still help in interviews. Then you have a DevOps for QA or testers. So like we saw other earlier, which you have DevOps or dev.azure.com. In the dev portal, you have test plans, and your testing team can look at these, saying how many tests are completed successfully, how many are run, how many are blockers, and so on. So from a single panel or single screen, they can check the status of the test cases. So that's DevOps for QA and testers. We're going to look at AI and machine learning for data scientists. So AI and machine learning application on Microsoft Azure. This will be useful if you're preparing for AI 900, AI 100, or DP 100. Mainly DP 100 is the one which is Azure Data Scientist. DP 100 will be useful. So let's have a quick look in what exactly is a AI and ML, and what data science services or what tools are available on Microsoft Azure. So if you look at impact of AI and machine learning, every industry is using, pretty much every industry that you see where you see use of AI and ML, be it banking and personal finance, to find out what are your credit risk of giving you credit, and based on that you can have a higher premium. Or it could be the same thing for insurance, or it could be in media, or it could be for politics and government. For if you might have heard of the elections, they are basically now based on our fight fought on based on AI and machine learning, where they predict what are the mood and swing of your users. That's AI and ML impact. Now, this is the diagram for AI, or high level you have artificial intelligence, which is a technique which enables machines to mimic a human behavior. And that artificial intelligence is done using a machine learning, so where machine learning is a subset, or machine learning is a subset of AI technique, which is used or which uses statistical methods to enable machines to improve with over a period of time as they learn from them. So that's a machine learning, or improve based on the experience. And then you have a deep learning, which is a subset of machine learning, which makes computation of multi-layer neural network feasible. And that is again used for machine learning and AI part, deep learning. So in a nutshell, in a simple terms, AI and machine learning is where you have an ordinary system with the help of AI and a machine learning. They learn and improve and predict, or they learn, predict, and improve constantly. That's what is happening with. So if you take an example where, let's suppose you're driving, or have recently bought a Tesla, and in that it predicts, basically it checks my behavior, and every morning I go and drop my son to school, and every time automatically the Tesla, the navigation system on that automatically says that, hey, it automatically set those that a map for me. And if I change my route, or if I go to another place, and if I follow that pattern few days, it picks up the new pattern then based on automatically. So that's example of AI and machine learning. So there are three type of AIs are available. First is pre-built AI, which is a Azure cognitive service. I'll explain that. Then you have a conversational AI, and then you have a custom AI, which is Azure machine learning. So let's begin with first what is pre-built AI. Now you have the pre-built AI, which is an Azure Cognitive Service, which are already built by Azure or Microsoft for you. So you have a vision where um, you must have seen on your phone, or Microsoft phone, or maybe Apple phone, based on vision it can detect, or you might have a number plate recognition system, or speech to text, where you speak something and it will type it here. So this is one of the service which I've picked up from Azure, where you have a cognitive service which is speech to text, and you click on speech button, and whatever you're speaking, it'll write it for you. So these are already done and built by Microsoft, which you can leverage or use in your application. Then you have a conversational AI, which is like chatbots to discuss and talk. So you have these days chatbot used pretty much every application, where you ask a question in your help desk, and it'll give a response based on the pattern. It'll constantly improve on that. So that's a conversational AI. And then you have a custom AI, which is machine learning. So machine learning, where you have a You have a lot of data. You you train a model using the data. You package that. Once you have the model finalized, you package them and you deploy it on a either a virtual machine or a Kubernetes cluster or containers, and then you get an endpoint which can then be used, that endpoint or service web service endpoint of the machine learning model, and you can then give any data to predict what's happening. So that's custom AI or machine learning. So few terminology, algorithm, then you have the machine learning and deep learning. So so algorithm is a sequence of calculations and rules used to solve a problem or analyze a set of data. So an algorithm may decide how to define whether a pet is a cat or a bird or a lizard. So you can have some properties about that and say if it has a four legs or maybe this shape or this size, this weight, what it can do or what its movement like that. Based on that, you can predict what a pet might be. So that's algorithm. Then you have machine learning, and machine learning is a AI technique that uses mathematical algorithms to create a predictive model. So where you can based on the data it learns, and once it has learned, then you give any other data and it'll predict what will be the outcome of that. That's a machine learning. Now, deep learning is a type of machine learning again, which determines for itself whether the predictions are accurate or not. And this is the good terminology to understand. So if even though you have a model, based on that, it's you pass on some data to it and it'll give you the result. The deep learning will predict whether the data output is coming, is it correct, or the output is coming or result is correct or not. That's a deep learning. So this is commonly used terminologies. You have machine learning workflow on. So this is where you have end-to-end workflow where you in typically if you're running a machine learning model, you're going to prepare the data and data might be coming from multiple sources. You put that data into or you build your model using any of your development choice or build your ID using a favorite tool like Jupyter Notebook or Microsoft Code Visual Code Studio, or you can once you have built the model, you are going to train the test the model and train it, and basically you're improving the model on here. Once you have you're happy with your model, then you're going to register that model into a model registry. And once this model is registered, you pick up that image and then deploy it either on a container or any compute of your choice. Once it's deployed, you get an endpoint, and that endpoint is given to the users, and you monitor that endpoint. So that's the end-to-end machine learning workflow. Now, Microsoft has a machine learning studio or workspace that will give you not only tools to run these algorithms, but all the associated security underlying infrastructure to run these. So you have the workspace, which is a machine learning workspace that can be linked to the data sources, like wherever your data might be, like Azure account we saw in earlier, or databases and so on. Then it will be this machine learning model will need some compute to run, so you can have run it on a compute instances or cluster of compute instances. You need security, you need storage account, you need monitoring, you get all of these dependencies. And within workspace, then you have environment, experiment, pipeline, dataset, model, endpoint. These are assets related to the machine learning. Again, if you're part of DP100, we are going to go deep into these assets on machine learning workspace. And once you have workspace you created, you'll get a machine learning studio like this, which is a graphical user interface to run all your machine learning algorithms. So this is where you have notebooks, you have automated ML, you can create designer, which is for graphical way of running your authoring the machine learning. You have all the data sets, which is running, which is where the model is going to lead and run. And this is where you see the experiment and so on. So this is all machine learning studio on for you. So that's in a nutshell on again a high level overview about AI and machine learning on Microsoft Azure. As a part of DP100, which is Azure Data Science, we have a certification training program. In that, we go deep into these. Again, if you're listening this in data science, you probably will be going deep into these topics. We're going to look at global infrastructure that consists of your geography, region, availability zone, or data centers or fault domain and update domain. So we'll talk about what is region and region pair, availability zone, fault domain and update domain, so that you have the or you get the availability options of like the percentage of virtual machine availability. So we are going to cover all this in this lesson. So first is, if you see at the top level, you have your data centers, and in data centers you have a rack or in which your servers are placed. So you assume this is a rack and that you have server 1, server 2, server 3 like that. So that is data center, which will have its own cooling, its own power, everything, networking, and so on. Then you have like that multiple data centers. Now, collection or grouping of different data centers, they make a availability zone. So within availability zone, you might have data center 1, data center 2, which are connected by a high bandwidth, low latency network, and they can so that these machines probably work as a single unit, or the machine within this data center and machine this is within this data center are very close with connected with low latency. Then you have multiple availability zones like that. So collection of availability zones is makes a region. So within a region, for example, you have a US region and US East. Within US East, you have US East 1, US East 2, and so on. Similarly, then within that's one region, you might have a US West and US West 1, US West 2, US West 3, which are these availability zones. And then collection of regions have a geography. So you have like US is a geography, India is a geography. Within India, you have a region called North India or maybe West India and South India or Central India and South India and so on. So geography has regions. Regions have one or more availability zones, and availability zone will have one or more fault domain or sorry data centers in which you have your servers placed. Now, so worldwide there are around 50 plus regions representing 140 countries. Now, the mark which is marked again, this is a I'm doing it in early 2021. In March 2021, this is a diagram where you have these blue dark dots are regions which are available for you. The circle ones, dotted circle one are the one which are regions announced, and within that, this square will represent a availability zone, that whether you have availability zone or here or not. So this is around 50 plus regions there. Now, regions are each there is a region which is connected with another region we call regional pairs, and that will help for disaster recovery, as we saw in site recovery and other one of the high availability in disaster recovery when we were discussing earlier. You can have one region, and then within a region you have availability zones like availability zone 1, availability zone 2, availability zone 3. These are all three connected with a high bandwidth low latency pipe. And within that availability zone, you have the data centers, DC1 and DC within data centers. Now, these region 1 and 2 are with a data residency boundary, meaning that with program like with government laws, you can have a data in one region and then that can go to other regions. So the regions are paired so that they adhere to the data residency boundary, which means if the boundary is US, the data will stay in US even though they are two different regions in US. So this is another way of representing region pair. You have a geography. Inside that you have a region pair, which you have region 1 and region 2, and they have their data centers. Now, the paired region, they have already defined. So in geography, you have Asia Pacific, you have East Asia and Southeast Asia. So in Hong Kong and Singapore. If you look at US or UK, you have UK West and UK South. If you have India, you have a Central India with South India. You also have West India with South India. So South India is common with Central and this. So the data is, these are paired. If you see Australia, there's Australia East and Australia Southeast. Now these region pair will help for your disaster recovery. So they are usually more than 300 miles apart. And these are used for recovery purpose or DR purpose. So as I said, you have ability zone 1, zone 2, zone 3 in a region. And then if one zone fails, you have another zone working so that your application is always active or available. So you have a VM1 here, VM2 here, and VM3 here. Even if this zone is not available, 2 and 3 will continue to work here, virtual machines. So that's availability zone. Then there is a concept of fault domain and update domain. And this is again a question in Azure fundamental if you're looking at this in Azure AZ900. So this is assume this is a server a rack. In that rack, you have server 1, server 2, server 3, server 4, and you have virtual machines placed. Similarly, you have so these racks will be counted as a fault domain. And so you have rack 2, rack 3, and fault domain. And within these racks, you have servers, which is update domain 1, update domain 2, update domain 3 as well. So update domain allows Azure to perform incremental or rolling upgrade across a deployment. So when they are doing the scheduled maintenance, they are probably doing in update domain 0, update domain 1, like that. So for they help on an incremental rolling upgrade. So during any plant maintenance, only one update domain is rebooted. So make sure that if you are doing within a data center, you have two machines, they are deployed on different update domain, and Microsoft will handle that for you so that you don't need to worry. So if you have two machines in a data center, they will go in two different update domain so that when during plant maintenance, only one update domain is rebooted, so your machine is active. Then you have a fault domain, which is nothing but a group of virtual machines that share a common set of hardware switches that share the single point of failure. So make sure that if you create two machines, they should not go under same fault domain. And that is done using availability set. So if you create a availability set, they always go across different fault domain. So you have a fault domain. So in this fault domain, if there is a fault develops, all the machines will go or will not be available if they are in same fault domain. And hence, you always try to put these machines into one fault domain 1 here and fault domain 2 here, so that if this fault domain goes down, you have another machine coming here. Now, this is automatically implemented if you create two machines in a same availability set. And there's a concept, you will not understand it right now, but when we're creating a machine, that time you will see availability set. Let me show it to you on the console itself when you're creating a virtual machine. So I'm on this here console, and I'm creating a Azure virtual machine under high availability set. So I'll say create a virtual machine. And if you see under availability options, so if you select a availability set, the one machine will go into one fault domain, and then if you create another virtual machine in the same availability set, then these two machines will automatically be placed in two different fault domains. So this is a concept about fault domain and update domain. It's important to know. So based on your requirement, if you need 99.9% SLA, then you can create a single VM and Microsoft Azure will commit for 99.9% uptime. If your service level agreement is 99.95%, then you deploy two machines in a availability set, which means within a data center, they will go under different fault domains. Microsoft will do it. So if you need 99.95% SLA, you achieve or you create two machines with availability set. However, if you need 99.99% SLA, then you create two machines but across availability zone. And again, when we were creating an option, there was an option, or you will see an option to say availability zone across. So you will create one in availability zone 1 and second in availability zone 2 for high availability. That way you get 99.99% uptime. And if you need disaster recovery, you create these across different regions. So that's the availability option for you. We are going to look at Azure Resource Manager. What is resource, resource group, and management group? Now, before we move forward, let's understand this terminology, and this is very important. It will go a long way if you understand this well. So resource is a manageable item that is available through Azure that you create. So for example, virtual machine is a resource, storage account is a resource, web app is a resource, database is a resource, network is a resource, load balancer is a resource. All these things is a resource. And now Collection of these resources is a resource group, or container that holds, or a logical container that holds these resources is a resource group. Now, why do you need this resource group? So you can apply policies, or you can look at the billing and say how much I have used for that particular billing. You can also control access on, you can globally delete all, once you delete the resource group, you can delete all the resources inside that and so on. So resource group comes very handy. Then you have a resource provider that is a service supplied by resources. So which they, for example, virtual machine resource is provided by a resource provider like Microsoft.compute. Similarly, your Blob, which is a object storage, is uh, provided by resource provider called Microsoft Azure Storage and so on. Then you have a resource manager template, which is a JavaScript object notation JSON format that defines one or more resources. You might have a virtual machine. Inside that, you have a web server. You might have a database connected to this. You inside a resource group. All these things combined together, you can put them into a JSON file so that you can always create using that JSON file, or the template um, will store the configuration about that particular setup. So these are some of the common things you'll be using. So if you look at this diagram, at the bottom layer you have resources like my virtual machine or network or table or SQL database or function and so on. Now these resources are collection of collecting, for example, these three resources in one resource group and so on. These resource group are created inside the subscription, and those subscriptions can have a management group. This is another layer for managing resources, especially when you have a big account. So this is your resource group, subscription, and management group. Then you have, if you look at this diagram here, you have a resource group, and these resource group are part of subscription. And then you manage these subscription resource group and resources using through something called as Azure Resource Manager, ARM. We'll see that in a minute. And this ARM can be accessed through a tool called PowerShell. We'll see that as well. Azure Portal, which we have already used number of times, and you also have Azure CLI, which is command line interface. We'll see that these three, Azure CLI and PowerShell in next lesson. So this is my resource group, subscription, and management group. Now this resource group you can classify in different ways. This is just a collection of resources. So you can say, you can have a resource group for VNet where you put all the virtual networks in one, so that you can grant access of admin privileges to this resource group to network engineers. Maybe read-only access to a system administrator, a virtual machine administrator. So you can do it based on that, where you have based on the resource, or you can say this is my production type resource group, this is my QA resource group, or this. Or you can say based on the department, you can say finance or marketing or HR. Or you can say prod finance, which means the finance department team, but for production environment, or dev finance. So there are different ways you can, based on how you want to protect and control and manage these resources, you can define resource group accordingly. Now there's another concept called management group. So management groups help you to manage access policies, or manage access and policies and compliance across multiple subscriptions. So you might have subscription 1, subscription 2, and multiple different subscriptions. At a management level, you can create a management group. So this is my one management group, which is root management group. Inside that, you have a HR management group, or you have an app management group as well. So they help you to manage access, who can do what, policies. So you can control something, saying that only this resource group can do only maybe this much size of virtual machine, or compliance across multiple subscriptions. So you can go and create a management group in Azure Cloud. Now this is a Azure Resource Manager, very important. You will hear again and again. So Azure Resource Manager is a deployment and management service for Azure. It provides management layer that can enable you to create, update, and delete your resources in Azure account. So this is a service which will help you to create this. And you can use these features like accessing control, logs, tags, again, when we do for administration part, or maybe your own resources, you'll be seeing using Azure Resource Manager. Now, this Azure Resource Manager can be invoked through Portal or PowerShell or CLI or REST clients. So, so think of ARM as a if you're using Terraform. Terraform is a cloud automation. If you've heard of cloud formation in AWS, similar to that, you have ARM and ARM templates. So that's my resource manager. We're going to look at management tools, or what tools are available for you to manage your Azure resources. So the first thing comes to your mind is Azure Portal, which is nothing but a graphical user interface to search your resources, services, or documents, to manage these resources, create some customized dashboards and favorites, and then access the cloud shell, which I'll cover in the next lesson or next slide, what that cloud service is, receive notifications and create a resources. So till now I've logged in a couple of times onto Azure portal to show you, but let me show it one more time onto the portal. So if you see, this is my Azure portal, and now this is where I can configure all look and feel and other things. So I can have it choose your default view. I have a home, or I can go for a dashboard view. I can say fly out or maybe a docked. I can change the color as well by creating a theme and say dark color or light color. I can say white background contrast or contrast as a white or none. So you can do all these configurations. You can create resources, you can set them, preferences, notification, and so on. So that's my Azure portal. So that's one of my management tool. Then I have a Cloud Shell, and within Cloud Shell, I have two things, which is a Bash and a PowerShell. So you see this icon here. This is my Cloud Shell, and when I start that, I'll do two things, either Bash or a PowerShell. So Bash is a command line interface. We can say CLI, and or CLI is a separate. You can install CLI manually as well. So this is a Bash, and this is a PowerShell. So from this Bash, I can start my command line interface. I can also download the software as your CLI and run it as well onto the client machine. So let me first go to Cloud Shell and show you Azure CLI, and we will log in and we'll say AZ space account space show. So you have a command line interface available within your browser, so you don't need to worry about, you don't need to install any client anywhere. You can access it directly from the browser within Azure portal. So this is what I was talking about. This is a Cloud Shell. Click on here, and this will open a new window here. Now, if you're doing it first time, it will say create a account or storage account. It will need some storage, that will pick it from storage account. So now it says you have no storage mounted. This is what you should be seeing. So this is my Azure PaaS. So I'll say yes, using this subscription, create a storage, because this shell will need some storage. It'll take few minutes for the first time. And now I have the command line. I can say AZ account, AZ is account, Azure account show, and it'll show me my account. And so it's showing me that I have a account. My tenant ID is this, environment name is Azure Cloud. But this is what I'm saying. This is my Azure PaaS. Like that, you can do other command line interface. You can create a machine, you can create storage, everything that you do see on from console, you can do it from command line as well. So that's is my Azure CLI. You can also manually install Azure CLI on your desktop, but then you need to connect or authenticate first from that CLI to the Azure cloud. Here, this is because it's coming from Cloud Shell. It's already logged into this Azure cloud account. So that's my Azure CLI. Then I also have a PowerShell, which is a set of commandlets for managing Azure resources directly from PowerShell. Now, if you are a Windows person, you probably might be familiar with PowerShell. It's the same PowerShell that you're doing. And I can then run slightly different like to achieve same thing. I can say get space AZ subscription. So let's go to the portal and show it here. So for now, let me close this and then do the Cloud Shell again. But this time I'll say that I want my PowerShell. So instead of here Bash, because I already selected, I probably will say here PowerShell and say switch to PowerShell. You say yes. And now it's switching to PowerShell. Let's move it a little bit up. Now I'm saying it's requesting a Cloud Shell, which is but for PowerShell. Now, not all services are, as of today, not every service is in PowerShell. There are some services which you can't do it from PowerShell. So you can use either CLI or REST API, or you can also use this portal. So just to show you the command, I'm running a command, PowerShell command, which is get my Azure subscriptions, which is get dash AZ subscription. Hit enter and it'll give me my subscription. I have two subscriptions. One is Azure PaaS and Microsoft Partner. The Microsoft Partner is disabled and another one is enabled. So that's my Azure PaaS or that's my PowerShell. So that's another tool. Then I have a Azure ARM templates. So you might have heard of infrastructure as a code, which an example like Terraform is an infrastructure as a code, or CloudFormation is a infrastructure as a code. So it implements, or ARM templates implement infrastructure as a code for your Azure resources using Azure Manager, Azure Resource Manager templates, or we call ARM templates. So this is a what you can do is if you can either write your own JSON in this format from scratch, which is saying my type is Azure storage account. So in this case, I'm creating a resource of type storage account. Name of that storage account is my storage account. It's going to be in West US location. The replication policy is standard local replication service, and then kind of the storage is storage version 2. And when I run this, I can create this resource. Or other option is if I don't have this, when I'm doing or creating something from Azure resource or using Azure portal, I can export that JSON file and use that JSON template to deploy my resources. How to register free for a Azure cloud account so that you can practice your Azure hands-on lab that you might be doing either on certification AZ 900 or AZ 103, 104, 300 or any other training related to Microsoft Azure. So we'll first begin with how to register for this free trial account from Azure, Microsoft Azure, and then we'll look at how can you access that console or cloud console so that you can practice and do things like creating identity and access management, networking, compute, storage, Active Directory, or SQL Server or SQL Microsoft SQL database or any other activity that you want to perform on this. Now, what you will notice on all the activity guides are additions, which will tell what is the latest or what edition of this guide is. And as you might be seeing right now, things might change in future and we might update the guides as things go forward or as anything changes. It will also have a list of last update, which means first two digits are for year and next two digits are for month and next two digits are on day. So that last update is on February the 9th, 2020. So year, month and date. Now, all the guides will have an index which will tell what to refer and if you want to go straight to a particular page. So we'll begin with the introduction. Then we'll look at documentation link that you might want to go and read more about these topics, like things like frequently asked questions, what things are free. Oh, that's documentation link. Then we'll look at frequently asked questions, what you will get free, when, how long. Then in chapter 4, we are going to talk about how to register for this free trial account. And then in 5th, we'll access the console and we'll give a very brief overview about the console. And then in next less video, we'll talk a little bit more about these consoles. So let's first begin with the introduction, which is about what this guide is about. And in that, there's a chapter second is about documentation link. So you will also get a step-by-step PDF activity guide. So you can use that guide and go to these URLs. First beginning with the sign-in URL, which is azure.com, and you can go on azure.com and access for a free trial account. If you want to have some questions, most of the questions are answered in frequently asked questions, FAQ on Azure free account. You can get this URL. Now, any of these URLs change, we'll update the guide as well. Now, if you're a student or if you don't have a credit card and you are still studying, then in that case, you may not have a credit card. So you can then register free from your student ID without a credit card. But what you will need is you will only get $100 free compared to when you have a credit card, then you get $200 free. So You can still register without a credit card, but you need a your student email address in that case. Then fourth link is for Azure Cloud homepage. How does Azure Cloud homepage look like? So what you're going to get is a 12-month of free services. So first of all, when you register with a credit card, you will get a $200 credit that you can use, and that should be sufficient for 30 days to practice. Now, most of the question we get on our training is that, oh, what to do after 30 days? Then maybe you use a different credit or use a different email address and phone number and create another trial account if you want to practice post 30 days and so on. Now, out of these, within that, once you have done that a month pass, or the Microsoft will not charge unless you upgrade it to the paid account. So make sure you are careful. Don't upgrade to paid account, or if you upgrade to paid account, you remember that you'll be charged for the services. So after 30 days, you can continue using the services, but you'll not be able to create any more. And the machines that are created within that free 12-month free services, only those, and within that limit will be free. So remember that as well. So my suggestion to you would be, if you don't want to pay, then after 30 days, don't upgrade to live session and or live paid program. So these are the services which are free for 12 months. Again, best place is to look at the documentation, which is given above. To that shows which service is free for how long. And then some products are always free, and these are very limited. For example, app service, we'll look at what is app service, or functions, and within functions, these many functions per month, or event grid, or Kubernetes services. We'll look at what all these services are, or Active Directory, B2C. All these services are within some limits are free. So, and we'll also look at what these different services are. So that's free. Now, first thing, now next move on to how to register for this trial account. So first you'll go to the azure.com, and then you go to top right where you see free account, and you'll click on free account, and then you will land on a page like that. And then you need to first register for the Microsoft account. And once you have the Microsoft account registered, then you can go for a free account. So let me first go onto the Azure portal and show it to you. So I'm going to azure.com. So rather than going to Azure for a student, I'll go for azure.com and hit enter. And then if you see here on right hand side, free account, click on a free account. Now you will get a create your Azure account free today. Get started with 12 months of free service. Now screens might change slightly later if you see. So don't worry if the screen changes. And click on start free. Now you should have a email address registered with Microsoft Online. So if I say use another account, and you can create, if you don't have any account with Microsoft here, you can create one. So I'm creating, for example, I already have an account. I can create it otherwise with K21technologies at gmail.com. I'm not going to use this account. I already have created this account, but let's assume if I want to create an account, and it say create a password for this account. We are not creating a cloud account yet. We're only creating a account on Microsoft. So I'm based in the United Kingdom, so I'll say January the 1st, and then maybe a year. This is a dummy account which I'm creating, so maybe 1980, and next. And it will send me a verification code, which I can get the verification code in the email address. And again, this is a one-time activity, and right now we are not yet on the actual account. So I'm on that Gmail account, and I got a confirmation saying Microsoft account, verify your email address. So I got a number 6013. So let's continue using this document or this email address itself, 6013, and click on next. Now it's asking me before I proceed, just enter the content or this account here. So YGJKS3N, and click on next. This is basically to make sure that it's not a spam and it's a genuine account or a human being. And now I'm back. I've signed in now, right now, using my account K21technologies at gmail.com. So now I have a not cloud account. I have a Microsoft account right now, and now I'm trying to create a Azure account. So first country, depending on where you are, wherever your credit card, the card is registered with the country. So you make sure you use that credit card or the country where the country the credit card is registered. In my case, I'm based in United Kingdom. I'll use United Kingdom. My first name is Atul and last name is Kumar. And the address that I used was K21technologies at gmail.com. So make sure you use the same email which you've used here. And then phone number, and then company VAT ID. I have a company VAT ID, but then I don't remember it, so I'll leave it optional field. I'll leave it blank. Click next. Now you need to make sure you give a phone number with select a correct country code and the phone number. And it says either text me or call me. So I'm saying text me, and I'll get a message on this number which I need to verify. This is to genuinely see that the phone number is correct. So I got the code number which is 363826. It will be different for different depending on what time. So I'll click on verify code. And now I'm on a screen which is my card holder name. So I'll enter my card name, Atul Kumar. Oh, and then I'll put the card number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording for some time. I'll enter the card number and all the country and click on next. So I'm not going to show that details here, but make sure you have either a Visa card, American Express or MasterCard, one of these three cards. And another thing I've noticed is if you are from India or any other country that doesn't have an international credit card enabled, make sure you enable international credit payments. Because it's going to deduct depending on which country you are, anything roughly around $1 or 2 Indian rupees or INR if you're from India, or depending on which country you are, it might deduct a very small amount, which is equivalent to, as I said, minimal, roughly around $1, which will be returned back to your account. So they want to verify that the card is genuine. And if you decide to upgrade, they should be able to take payment out from that card. So that's why this card is required. So I'm going to stop recording now, but make sure if there's a problem, you reach out to your bank and tell them that you're expecting a payment to be done to someone in possibly it's Singapore, or depending on which country you are, it might be the same country, it could be other countries. So make sure that you have a international payment enabled. So let me pause it and I'll come back once I've entered my credit card details. Okay, so I've entered my card number and its identity verification by card. It's already verified by phone number as well as by the card number. And under agreement, you need to say, I agree to subscription agreement and select this. If you want to get the tips from Microsoft, then select this. And if you don't want any tips or newsletter or any update, then you can uncheck the second button. My suggestion to you would be keep it checked so that you can see any new offers, new things or tips on Microsoft Azure. Click on sign up, and now it's going to validate your account. So I'm getting $150 pounds credit, which is equivalent to roughly around $200 in credit from Microsoft Azure. So it's signing me up, and it'll give me, now it's saying setting up your account. It's basically setting up my account and behind the scenes. Let me see if I get any emails on my Gmail. It's nothing right now. So it's only the first email address, which was verify my phone number, or sorry, my email ID. So it's setting up my account, and I'll pause this recording for a few minutes. Now I get a message saying that you're ready to start with Azure, and you can go to the portal. If you scroll down, you can say join the demo of the C Azure in action, and it'll tell you some tips and tricks as well here. Now, if you want a live demo to or watch on demand, then there's some more content related to the training material which Oracle provides. So I can say watch on demand and register for the demos. I'll register for the demo here, and I'll change the address K21, or I'll leave it to my personal account, official email address, and then I accept and click submit. Again, you don't need to do it. This is mainly for a training on demand. The more content, and again, In the training program, we are going to cover most of the things which are important things for you to learn. So you can skip that if you want. Now, now I've created my account and I can now go to the portal by clicking on this button here, portal, which is portal.azure.com. And because I've already logged in, it may not even ask me to log in again. But let me log out from here, and this is the console here, which you'll be able to access it. I'm going to log in again and tell you a little bit about navigation. So that you have completed this registration part. If you want, you can look at the tour and you can take a tour which says that this is where left hand side, this is where you're going to create all the resources. So it's guiding me now. It'll give you a glimpse of what to expect when, where. So this is where you go and create all the resources like your app services, your databases, your storage, networking, all the building blocks for Azure, Microsoft Azure. Then you click on next. This is where home page is, and this is where to see all the services, common task, recently used resources or online training, everything under this one single home page. This is your dashboard, and you can customize this dashboard to display what exactly you want to see on the dashboard. So it's quite handy. There's a mobile app as well. If you notice, we'll download this app as well later. And then this is where you will have all the services which are available from Microsoft Azure. We'll see that as well in a minute. Now, this is where all your favorites are. You can set your favorites and basically for quickly going to that particular services. So all your Azure resources are under here under favorites. Now, this is where you can quickly search for any resource on here, top and right side here, any resources you want to access. Then this is where your directory and subscription. So you can switch between the directories or use a global subscription filter to filter the resources in the portal. I'm going to discuss about this a little bit later. You may not need it right now. Then this is where you will get all the notifications, which will tell, like, let's suppose we have just created an account. If any services have gone down, or if you're coming closer to your using all the amount that you have, all those things will be mentioned here. Then this is where you can go and take help from Microsoft Azure or reach out to their support team to create a support ticket. And this is where your account details are. So I've used K21technologies at gmail.com. I don't monitor this email, so please don't send any email to that. Your email will be missed or not picked up. So then you can click on finish here, and this is what we have created a trial account on Azure. I'm going to cover remaining things in subsequent videos. So big congratulations for understanding this. Now task on you is go and create a trial account. If you don't have already have, make sure you create first a email address, register your email address with Microsoft website, and using that email address, then you can create a Azure trial account. So just to look at a recap, we have already created these, entered our passwords. We have entered our details on this. We have entered our phone number. We have also entered the credit card. Now, credit card are important for you is if you don't have a credit card, you can create an account using your college email ID or school email ID. If you're a student, then you can still create an account, but without a credit card. But in that case, you will only get $100 or I think $150 credit for this. Now, this account or documentation is based on India when we were registering from India, and the video I've showed you registering from UK. You might screens might be slightly different and the amount might be slightly different depending on if you're doing it from US, Singapore, Australia, or depending whatever country you are from. And then once you're verified, you can then be able to, oh, let me see if I got an email saying welcome to Azure free account and whether we got a confirmation or not. So if you see my email address, I also got an email saying welcome your Azure free account, and this is where you will see Azure Live Portal and understand the cloud fundamentals as well. So we'll cover these fundamentals in our training program, so you don't need to worry about it. We'll try to make short and concise. There's already a lot of information available on the portal or on different sites. The challenge right now is how to understand, see what is relevant, and only focus on things that you need at that point. We want to avoid information of overload to you and focus on what is required in order to achieve a particular objective. So make sure you get an keep these links handy, and if you want to learn more, there's a lot of material already available, but we'll cover in the training program as well. So you've already taken a tour. You know how to log in now and walk through on the different services. And that's how we have completed, or big congratulations that you've completed the activity guide 1 on creating a trial account. We'll use this account in future now to create all the services. So now, action on you. Go and create a trial account and make sure you can log into the Azure port. So just to do a quick recap, what we have done is we started with Azure basic cloud overview, including scalability, elasticity, bring your own license. We went into service model, deployment model, and the important thing to understand is account and subscription. And this is what I was talking about. You'll be creating a free or Azure free trial or trial subscription. Then Azure services overview, Active Directory or Azure Active Directory, users, groups, different type of compute. So this is one of the core services after IAM, the networking, another core service, storage, and then data platform if you're working on DP 200, 201 or DP 203. Data protection, monitoring, log analytics, security, and then Azure DevOps if you're working on AZ 400. AI machine learning data science for DP 100. And then basic from an infrastructure point of view, what is a region, geography, availability zone, update domain and fault domain. You should also understand resource and resource group, because these things will help you to understand later when you're creating any resources, you'll be doing these things, resource group. How do you manage these resources using portal, command line interface, PowerShell and ARM template. And depending on which training you are, you may or may not have PowerShell. Some courses have, some courses not, but most probably you'll be using extensively portal or command line interface, and then finally register the account. So once you've gone through, make sure you put it in WhatsApp group and say you've completed this bonus module about cloud, Azure Cloud for beginners, and let me know how do you feel now. Again, this is just an overview, so we have not gone into deep. Depending on which training you're listening this, we'll be going in some part of these modules in deep.
We take you from complete beginner level, that is Azure fundamentals, to associate level, which is level 2, and expert level, which is level 3 certification. Microsoft Azure Fundamentals AZ900 is the first exam for beginners in cloud that is targeted for both technical and non-technical background. If you are a beginner, this is the first exam which I would recommend you to take before doing any other certification on Azure. AZ104 is a level 2 exam that should be given by administrators. So anyone with a technical background who needs to validate their administrator level knowledge around cloud services can opt for this certification. In order to become a Microsoft Solutions Architect, you need to give two exams. First exam is AZ303, which is Microsoft Azure Architect Technologies, which is actually implementation work. Second exam is AZ304, which is Microsoft Azure Architect Design. So when you complete both the exams, then you get certified as Microsoft Certified Azure Solutions Architect Expert. If someone wants to choose their career in DevOps field, then you can choose Microsoft Azure DevOps Certification exam, which is AZ400. So this exam requires DevOps professionals who are capable of combining processes, people, and technologies for continuously delivering services and products that meet business objectives and user needs. If you want to build your career as Microsoft Certified Azure Data Engineer Associate, you can choose DP203, which is a new version of DP200 and DP201, right? So implementing an Azure data solution, which is DP200, and designing an Azure data solution, which is DP201. DP100 is a level 2 associate level certification, and that is applicable for anyone who is working or would like to work on artificial intelligence, data science, or machine learning. So if you are interested in any of these certifications, feel free to comment below in the comment section. I would like to invite you for a free masterclass on how to start your journey as Azure Solutions Architect, right from basics to advanced level, which covers most of the topics like why and who should learn Azure Cloud, Azure Certification Roadmap for Architects, Azure Architecture, and many other topics. If you are interested in this free class, you can visit k21academy.com/AzureSA02